Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we venture into the frozen frontier of terror with 8 of the most disturbing true Alaskan missing tourist horror stories ever documented. These harrowing testimonies emerge not from fiction or hearsay, but from meticulously investigated disappearances that have left both authorities and families searching for answers in America's last wilderness. Each account exposes the unforgiving nature of Alaska's remote landscapes, where tourists seeking adventure instead found themselves vanishing without explanation into the vast tundra, treacherous mountains, and endless stretches of Arctic wilderness. The evidence has been carefully gathered from official reports, witness statements, and search and rescue documentation, guaranteeing that every detail remains grounded in verifiable fact, though certain personal identifiers have been altered to respect the privacy of those affected. If you have not yet become part of our dedicated community of true horror followers, please subscribe to Buried Files and enable the notification bell so you never miss an episode when we explore the darkness that lurks in our world. Make sure to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on these cases or any experiences you may have had in Alaska's remote wilderness. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. The final text message from Dr. Marites Buenafe arrived at her family's phones at exactly 7:35 in the morning on July 1st, 2025. The 62-year-old physician from Lexington, Kentucky had typed out her plans with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. She was taking the Mount Roberts tramway to the summit and would hike the popular Gold Ridge to Gastineau Peak Trail, a moderately challenging 4-mile route that promised spectacular views of Juneau and the surrounding wilderness. Her message was cheerful and confident, signed off with her characteristic optimism about the adventure that lay ahead. She had no way of knowing that those words would become the last communication her loved ones would ever receive from her. Dr. Buenafe had been traveling aboard the Norwegian Bliss cruise ship as part of a week-long Alaska expedition that had departed from Seattle, fulfilling a lifelong dream of exploring America's final frontier. She was not traveling alone on the cruise itself, having been accompanied by 2 family members who shared her passion for outdoor adventures and natural beauty. However, she had chosen to tackle this particular hike solo, confident in her abilities as an experienced outdoorswoman who had spent decades building the physical fitness and mental toughness required for challenging wilderness excursions. Her colleagues at UK Healthcare knew her as someone who approached both medicine and mountaineering with the same careful preparation and unwavering determination. The Mount Roberts tramway represented the perfect starting point for Dr. Buenafe's planned adventure, whisking visitors from Juneau's downtown area up 1,800 feet to a scenic overlook that served as the gateway to some of southeastern Alaska's most spectacular hiking opportunities. The tramway had been operating since 1996, providing safe and reliable access to trails that would otherwise require grueling climbs through dense temperate rainforest. From the summit station, hikers could choose from several well-marked routes that ranged from easy nature walks suitable for cruise passengers wearing street clothes to challenging backcountry treks that demanded proper equipment and wilderness experience. Security cameras captured Dr. Buenafe's arrival at the tramway's upper terminal around 7:30 that morning, showing her departing the visitor center buildings with the confident stride of someone who had done this type of hiking many times before. She appeared well prepared for the expedition, wearing appropriate outdoor clothing and carrying what seemed to be adequate supplies for the planned 4-hour round-trip hike. The weather conditions that morning were typical for southeast Alaska in early July. Cloudy skies with intermittent drizzle and temperatures in the mid-50s. Exactly the type of conditions that experienced Alaska hikers learn to expect and prepare for during the brief summer season. The Gold Ridge to Gastineau Peak trail that Dr. Buenafé had chosen was described by hiking websites as moderately challenging but extremely popular among both locals and tourists who wanted to experience Alaska's wilderness without venturing too far from civilization. The trail gained approximately 900 feet of elevation over its 4-mile length, winding through subalpine meadows filled with wildflowers during the summer months before reaching exposed ridgeline areas that offered panoramic views of the Gastineau Channel, Douglas Island, and the ice-capped peaks of the Coast Range. On clear days, hikers could see for dozens of miles in every direction, but the frequent clouds and precipitation that characterized southeast Alaska's maritime climate often limited visibility to just a few hundred yards. The Norwegian Bliss was scheduled to depart Juneau at 1:30 that afternoon, giving Dr. Buenafé what should have been ample time to complete her planned hike and return to the ship. Cruise itineraries typically build in generous margins for passenger excursions, understanding that weather delays and other unforeseen circumstances can affect timing. However, when 1:30 arrived without any sign of Dr. Buenafé, ship personnel began the standard protocols for passengers who failed to return by the all-aboard deadline. They attempted to contact her through the ship's public address system and tried calling her cell phone, but received no response to either method of communication. By 3:15 that afternoon, with the Norwegian Bliss already departed from Juneau and Dr. Buenafé still missing, her family members contacted local authorities to report her disappearance. The Alaska State Troopers immediately launched a comprehensive search and rescue operation, coordinating with multiple agencies that had extensive experience in southeast Alaska's challenging terrain. Juneau Mountain Rescue, widely regarded as one of the most skilled volunteer search and rescue organizations in the state, deployed their most experienced teams to begin systematic ground searches along the trail Dr. Buenafé had planned to hike. The initial search efforts benefited from the long daylight hours of early July, when Juneau experiences nearly 19 hours of usable light each day. Ground teams equipped with specialized equipment began hiking the Gold Ridge Trail in both directions, looking for any signs that Dr. Buenafé had passed through the area or encountered difficulties along the route. Search and rescue dogs trained to detect human scent were brought in from Southeast Alaska Dogs for Organized Ground Search, a volunteer organization that had participated in dozens of successful rescues throughout the region. The dogs would prove crucial in search operations, as their sensitive noses could detect traces of human presence that might be invisible to even the most experienced human searchers. Aerial searches began almost immediately, utilizing both Alaska State Trooper helicopters and aircraft from the United States Coast Guard that were specially equipped for search and rescue operations in Alaska's demanding conditions. The helicopters carried thermal imaging equipment capable of detecting body heat through forest canopies and cloud cover, technology that had proven successful in previous search operations throughout southeast Alaska. However, the weather conditions that had been merely unpleasant for hiking became serious obstacles for aerial searches, with low clouds and intermittent precipitation limiting visibility and making it dangerous for aircraft to operate at low altitudes in the mountainous terrain. The search operation expanded dramatically on the second day, with more than a dozen professional volunteers from Juneau Mountain Rescue joining Alaska State Troopers and Juneau Police Department officers in an extensive grid search that utilized drones, additional search dogs, and expanded ground teams. The searchers methodically covered every accessible area along the planned hiking route, looking not only for Dr. Buenafé herself, but for any equipment, clothing, or other signs that might indicate what had happened during her hike. Despite these exhaustive efforts, the teams found no trace of the missing physician, a result that was both frustrating and increasingly ominous as the hours turned into days. Weather conditions continued to hamper the search efforts throughout the second and third days. with low clouds and rain limiting the effectiveness of both ground and aerial teams. Southeast Alaska's maritime climate can change rapidly, and what had begun as merely cloudy conditions on the morning of Dr. Buenafe's hike deteriorated into the type of weather that makes wilderness travel treacherous, even for experienced outdoors people. The combination of wet conditions, limited visibility, and steep terrain created hazardous conditions for the searchers themselves, forcing search coordinators to balance the urgent need to find Dr. Buenafe against the safety of the dozens of people risking their lives to locate her. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning, July 4th, when the crew of an Alaska Army National Guard helicopter spotted something unusual approximately 1,700 feet below the Gold Ridge ridgeline. Using specialized equipment and flying techniques developed specifically for Alaska's challenging search and rescue environment, the helicopter crew was able to confirm that they had located Dr. Buenafe's body in an area that would have been extremely difficult for ground searchers to access safely. The location was far below the established hiking trail, suggesting that she had either fallen or become disoriented and wandered off the marked route during her attempted hike. The recovery operation required careful coordination between Alaska State Troopers, Juneau Mountain Rescue, Temsco helicopters, and the Alaska Army National Guard, utilizing specialized high-angle rescue techniques to safely retrieve Dr. Buenafe's body from the remote location where she had been found. The challenging terrain and continued poor weather conditions made the recovery operation nearly as dangerous as the original search had been, demonstrating the extreme difficulties that face anyone who ventures into Southeast Alaska's wilderness areas without proper preparation and support. The successful recovery was a testament to the skill and dedication of Alaska's search and rescue community. But it came too late to save Dr. Buenafe's life. Dr. Buenafe's body was transported to the Alaska State Medical Examiner's office for an autopsy that would determine the exact cause of her death, though the circumstances of her discovery suggested that she had likely fallen from the ridge area during her attempted hike. The investigation would examine whether weather conditions, equipment failure, medical emergency, or other factors had contributed to the tragedy that claimed the life of a skilled physician who had simply wanted to experience the natural beauty of Alaska during her vacation. Her death served as a sobering reminder that even experienced hikers can encounter unexpected dangers in Alaska's wilderness areas, where rescue may be hours or days away and where weather conditions can change from pleasant to life-threatening in a matter of minutes. The loss of Dr. Marites Buenafe deeply affected not only her family and colleagues at UK Healthcare, but also the broader community of outdoor enthusiasts who recognized that her tragedy could have befallen any of them under similar circumstances. Norwegian Cruise Line expressed their condolences and provided support to her family through their crisis response team, while the various search and rescue organizations reflected on lessons learned that might help prevent similar tragedies in the future. Dr. Buenafe's death highlighted the inherent risks that exist whenever people venture into Alaska's wilderness areas, no matter how well prepared or experienced they might be, and served as a reminder that the mountains and forests of the last frontier demand constant respect and vigilance from those who seek to explore their beauty. The June afternoon when Joseph Balderas disappeared from Nome, Alaska was supposed to mark the beginning of his new life in America's final frontier. At 36 years old, the Texas native had driven over 3,000 miles to reach this remote settlement perched on the edge of the Bering Sea, leaving behind the suffocating heat of Houston for the promise of adventure and opportunity in the last frontier. His girlfriend Megan Ryder had followed him just 2 weeks later, their hearts full of dreams about building a future together in a place where the summer sun barely set and the winter aurora painted the sky in impossible colors. Joseph had secured work with a local construction company that specialized in maintaining the harsh infrastructure needed to survive in subarctic conditions. The pay was excellent, nearly double what he had earned back in Texas, and the housing was surprisingly affordable for a man accustomed to big city prices. Nome might have been isolated, accessible only by small aircraft or seasonal barge, but it offered something Houston never could: the chance to be part of a tight-knit community where everyone knew your name and your neighbors would risk their lives to help you survive the brutal winters that claimed the unprepared. Megan had been more hesitant about the move, concerned about leaving her teaching job and the family they had known all their lives. But Joseph's enthusiasm proved contagious, and his detailed phone calls describing the stunning landscapes and genuine warmth of the locals gradually won her over. He talked about hiking the tundra that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, about learning to pan for gold in the creeks where prospectors had struck it rich over a century ago, about the incredible silence that settled over the land when the wind stopped blowing. In his letters, he painted pictures of a place where they could truly start fresh, away from the complications and disappointments that had followed them in Texas. The couple had been planning their engagement for months, with Joseph intending to propose during the brief summer when Nome transformed from a snow-covered outpost into a bustling hub of mining activity and tourism. He had already picked out a ring from one of the local jewelry stores, a simple band embedded with genuine Alaskan gold that would symbolize their new beginning in this incredible wilderness. Their wedding would be small and intimate, perhaps held on the beach where the Bering Sea met the tundra, with the midnight sun providing natural illumination for their ceremony. On June 24th, Joseph set out alone for what was supposed to be a short hiking expedition into the tundra northeast of Nome. He had been planning the trip for days, studying topographical maps with local residents who warned him about the deceptive nature of the landscape, where gentle rolling hills could quickly give way to treacherous bogs and hidden creeks. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the mid-60s, perfect conditions for exploring the wildflowers that carpeted the Arctic plains during the brief summer season. He carried a fully stocked backpack with emergency supplies, a GPS unit, and enough food and water for 2 days, even though he planned to return by evening. Megan was working her first shift at the local elementary school, helping with their summer reading program when Joseph kissed her goodbye that morning. He promised to be back in time for dinner, excited to share whatever discoveries he might make during his exploration of their new homeland. She remembers him standing in their tiny apartment doorway, backpack slung over his shoulder, his face bright with the kind of anticipation she had not seen since they were teenagers planning their first camping trip together. That image would haunt her for years afterward. Joseph silhouetted against the endless Arctic daylight, waving goodbye with no idea he would never return home. When Joseph failed to appear by midnight, Megan began making phone calls to his co-workers and the few local friends they had begun to cultivate. Nome operated on a different schedule during the summer months, with many residents staying active well into the traditional nighttime hours, taking advantage of the perpetual daylight to accomplish tasks that would be impossible during the dark winter months. But nobody had seen Joseph since he left town that morning, and his cell phone went straight to voicemail, suggesting he was either in an area with no coverage or his battery had died. The Nome Police Department launched a search operation at dawn the next day, coordinating with Alaska State Troopers and local volunteer search and rescue teams who knew the surrounding terrain better than anyone. They found Joseph's backpack approximately 8 miles northeast of town, sitting upright against a small boulder as if he had carefully placed it there before walking away. The backpack contained all of his supplies: food, water, emergency shelter, first aid kit, even his wallet and identification. The only items missing were the clothes he had been wearing and the small digital camera he always carried to document their Alaskan adventures. What disturbed the search teams most was the complete absence of any trail leading away from the backpack. The tundra around Nome preserves footprints remarkably well during the summer months, when the permafrost creates a solid base beneath the surface vegetation. Joseph's tracks were clearly visible, leading to the spot where they found his pack, but there were no footprints indicating which direction he might have traveled afterward. The search dogs brought in from Anchorage lost his scent at the same location, as if he had simply vanished into the thin Arctic air. As the search expanded to cover over 50 square miles of tundra, Megan began learning about Nome's dark history of unexplained disappearances. Local residents, initially reluctant to discuss the subject with outsiders, gradually opened up about the 24 people who had vanished from the area between 1960 and 2004. Most of the missing were men between the ages of 20 and 40, many of them newcomers to Alaska, who had come north seeking work or adventure just like Joseph. The FBI had investigated these disappearances extensively but never found evidence of foul play, concluding that the harsh environment and isolation were the most likely explanations. The revelation that Joseph was not Nome's first unexplained disappearance sent shockwaves through the small community and created deep divisions among residents. Some believed that discussing the missing people would damage Nome's reputation and hurt the tourism industry that provided crucial seasonal income. Others argued that the families deserved answers and that ignoring the pattern would only put more lives at risk. Longtime residents whispered about everything from serial killers to supernatural forces, while newer arrivals like Megan demanded thorough investigations and accountability from law enforcement. Megan threw herself into researching every detail of the previous disappearances, spending countless hours at the Nome Library and interviewing elderly residents who remembered the earlier cases. She discovered disturbing patterns. Many of the missing had been described as experienced outdoorsmen who should have known how to survive in the wilderness. Several had left behind personal belongings in locations where they seemed to have vanished without explanation, and almost none of the bodies had ever been recovered despite extensive searches. The lack of physical evidence was particularly troubling in a landscape where human remains should be preserved by the cold, dry conditions. The search for Joseph continued for 3 weeks, utilizing helicopters, all-terrain vehicles, trained search dogs, and dozens of volunteers who combed every accessible square mile of tundra around Nome. Alaska State Troopers brought in specialized equipment designed for Arctic conditions, including ground-penetrating radar that could detect buried objects beneath the permafrost. The Coast Guard searched the coastline in case Joseph had somehow made his way to the Bering Sea, while local pilots flew grid patterns over the vast wilderness that stretched toward Siberia. Despite these exhaustive efforts, no trace of Joseph was ever found. As summer turned to autumn and the search was officially suspended, Megan faced the devastating reality that she might never know what happened to the man she had planned to marry. The stress of the disappearance and the community tensions it had created made staying in Nome unbearable, but leaving felt like abandoning Joseph to whatever fate had befallen him in the unforgiving wilderness. She struggled with guilt over not insisting on accompanying him that final morning, wondering if her presence might have prevented the tragedy or at least provided answers about what had occurred in those crucial moments when he disappeared. The case attracted national attention when podcast investigator Payne Lindsay arrived in Nome years later to examine both Joseph's disappearance and the subsequent vanishing of Florence Okpialuk in 2020. His investigation revealed the deep mistrust and paranoia that had infected the community, with residents reluctant to share information and law enforcement agencies sometimes working at cross purposes. The attention brought new scrutiny to Nome's history of missing persons, but also intensified the divisions that had been tearing the town apart since Joseph first walked into the tundra and vanished without explanation. Today, Joseph's disappearance remains one of Alaska's most haunting unsolved mysteries. a reminder of how quickly the frontier can reclaim those who underestimate its power. Megan eventually returned to Texas, but she continues to advocate for missing persons cases and maintains hope that someday the tundra will reveal its secrets and provide the closure that has eluded her for so many years. Joseph's story serves as a sobering warning for anyone tempted by Alaska's beauty to remember that the last frontier demands respect, preparation, and an understanding that some who venture into its embrace are never allowed to leave. The morning of October 16, 1972 dawned clear and cold across south-central Alaska, with the first hints of winter already painting the mountaintops in pristine white. At Anchorage International Airport, a small Cessna 310C bearing tail number N1812H sat on the tarmac, its twin engines warming up for what should have been a routine 3-hour flight to Juneau. The aircraft carried 4 passengers whose names would become legendary in Alaskan aviation history. House Majority Leader Thomas Hale Boggs from Louisiana, Alaska Congressman Nicholas Joseph Begich, Begich's aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns. None of them could have imagined that their departure at 8:56 that morning would mark the beginning of one of the most extensive search operations in American history, or that their disappearance would give birth to decades of speculation about everything from political conspiracy to supernatural phenomena in the region that would later be dubbed the Alaska Triangle. Hale Boggs had arrived in Alaska as part of a 48-hour campaign blitz designed to support his colleague Nick Begich, who was facing a surprisingly competitive re-election battle against Republican challenger Don Young. At 58 years old, Boggs was one of the most powerful politicians in Washington, having served 14 non-consecutive terms in the House of Representatives and wielding considerable influence as the Democratic Majority Leader. His presence in Alaska was particularly significant because he and Begich had been on opposite sides of a leadership contest just a year earlier, making this campaign trip as much about party unity as it was about electoral politics. The two men had spent the previous evening at a fundraising event in Anchorage, where Boggs had delivered his characteristic passionate speeches about democratic values and the importance of Alaska's voice in Congress. Nick Begich, at 39, represented the new generation of Alaskan political leadership, a man who understood both the unique challenges facing America's largest state and the complex relationship between Alaska and the federal government. Born and raised in Minnesota, Begich had moved to Alaska in the early 1960s, establishing himself as an educator and community leader before winning election to Congress in 1970. His campaign for re-election was focused on bringing federal resources to Alaska, while protecting the state's independence and natural resources from what he saw as overreaching federal bureaucracy. The flight to Juneau was intended to be the final stop on a statewide campaign tour that would culminate in a major fundraising event designed to give Begich the financial resources needed for the final push toward Election Day. The weather forecast for the flight had called for marginal visual flight rules conditions along the route, with low clouds and possible icing conditions in the mountain passes between Anchorage and Juneau. Don Johns, the pilot employed by Pan Alaska Airways, was an experienced aviator who had flown this route numerous times and understood the challenges posed by Alaska's rapidly changing weather patterns. The Cessna 310C was a capable twin-engine aircraft, well-suited for Alaska's demanding conditions. Equipped with the necessary instruments for flying in challenging weather and powered by reliable engines that had proven themselves throughout the state's aviation community. However, the aircraft was not equipped with an emergency locator transmitter, despite Alaska state regulations that had recently been enacted requiring such devices on aircraft operating in the territory. At 9:09 that morning, Don Johns made his final radio contact with Anchorage Air Traffic Control. requesting updated weather information as the aircraft approached the mountainous terrain surrounding Portage Pass. This routine communication gave no indication of any problems aboard the aircraft, and weather conditions at the time appeared to be within acceptable limits for the flight to continue. The planned route would take the Cessna through some of Alaska's most spectacular but challenging terrain, including mountain passes where sudden weather changes could create treacherous flying conditions and vast wilderness areas where a downed aircraft might remain hidden for decades. After that final radio transmission, N1812H vanished from all radar screens and never made another verifiable radio contact, disappearing somewhere over the trackless wilderness between Anchorage and Juneau. When the Cessna failed to arrive in Juneau by its scheduled arrival time of noon, airport authorities initiated standard overdue aircraft procedures, attempting to establish radio contact and alerting search and rescue coordinators about the missing flight. By early afternoon, it became clear that something serious had happened to the aircraft carrying two of America's most prominent politicians, and a massive search operation was launched that would eventually involve every branch of the military, the Coast Guard, Civil Air Patrol, and dozens of civilian pilots who volunteered their aircraft and expertise. The initial search focused on the planned flight route, particularly the mountain passes and glaciated terrain where weather-related accidents were most likely to occur. The search operation that followed would become the largest and most extensive in Alaskan history, ultimately involving more than 400 aircraft and thousands of personnel over the course of 39 days. Coast Guard cutters searched the waters of Prince William Sound and the Gulf of Alaska, while Army and Air Force helicopters combed the mountainous terrain along the flight route. Civil Air Patrol volunteers flew hundreds of hours in small aircraft, systematically searching every valley and glacier for any sign of the missing Cessna. The search was complicated by Alaska's vast distances and challenging terrain, as well as weather conditions that frequently grounded aircraft and limited visibility to just a few hundred feet. Despite the enormous resources devoted to finding N1812H, searchers never located so much as a single piece of debris from the aircraft. The failure to find any trace of the aircraft led to intense speculation about what might have caused the disappearance, with theories ranging from mechanical failure and weather-related accidents to far more sinister explanations involving political conspiracy and sabotage. Some observers noted that Hale Boggs had been increasingly critical of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover and had called for investigations into government surveillance activities, leading to speculation that the disappearance might have been orchestrated by federal agencies seeking to silence a troublesome politician. These conspiracy theories were fueled by the complete absence of any physical evidence from the crash site, which seemed unusual even by Alaska standards, where aircraft accidents typically left at least some recoverable debris. The investigation into the disappearance revealed several troubling details about the flight preparation and equipment aboard N1812H. The National Transportation Safety Board determined that the aircraft was not equipped with a functioning emergency locator transmitter, despite Alaska state regulations requiring such devices on aircraft operating in remote areas. Investigators discovered that Don Johns's portable emergency transmitter had been left behind in another aircraft at Fairbanks, and witnesses reported seeing an unidentified object in the pilot's briefcase that resembled but was not identical to a portable emergency locator device. This lack of emergency equipment meant that even if the aircraft had survived an initial impact, searchers would have had no electronic signal to guide them to the crash site. Radio operators throughout Alaska reported hearing fragmentary transmissions that might have come from the missing aircraft during the days following the disappearance. But none of these reports could be conclusively verified or used to narrow the search area. The reported transmissions included garbled voices that some listeners believed sounded like distress calls. But the poor quality and brief duration of these signals made positive identification impossible. These unconfirmed radio contacts only added to the mystery surrounding the flight, raising questions about whether the aircraft had survived an initial emergency, only to crash later in a location even more remote than the planned flight route. The political implications of the disappearance became apparent almost immediately, as both Boggs and Begich were on the ballot for the November election despite being missing and presumed dead. In one of the stranger chapters of American electoral history, both men were re-elected to Congress while search operations for their aircraft continued. Hale Boggs was succeeded in office by his wife Lindy, who would serve 8 terms representing Louisiana's 2nd Congressional District, while Nick Begich was ultimately replaced by his Republican challenger Don Young, who would go on to serve Alaska in Congress for the next 49 years until his own death in 2022. The Begich family would continue to play a prominent role in Alaska politics, with Nick's descendants serving in various elected offices, including the United States Senate and the mayoralty of Anchorage. The disappearance of N1812H would become the foundational case for what paranormal investigators later dubbed the Alaska Triangle, a vast area of wilderness bounded roughly by Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow, where an unusually high number of aircraft and people have vanished without explanation. Proponents of supernatural theories point to the Boggs-Begich disappearance as evidence that mysterious forces operate within this region, noting the complete absence of any recoverable debris and the failure of such an extensive search operation to locate even the smallest trace of the aircraft. Skeptics argue that Alaska's challenging terrain and weather conditions provide sufficient explanation for the disappearance, particularly given the aircraft's lack of proper emergency equipment and the marginal weather conditions along the flight route. Modern technology has renewed interest in solving the 53-year-old mystery, with some investigators suggesting that climate change and glacial melting might eventually reveal the wreckage of N1812H. Several military aircraft that crashed in Alaska during the 1940s and 1950s have been discovered in recent years as glaciers retreat and expose previously hidden crash sites, raising hopes that the Boggs-Begich aircraft might someday be found. Advanced search technologies including satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, and sophisticated aircraft tracking systems have been proposed for renewed search efforts, though the vast size of the potential search area continues to present enormous challenges. The legacy of the October 16, 1972 disappearance extends far beyond the immediate political consequences, serving as a sobering reminder of the dangers that continue to face aviators operating in Alaska's unforgiving environment. The case influenced federal aviation regulations requiring emergency locator transmitters on aircraft, potentially saving lives in subsequent aviation emergencies. More broadly, the disappearance of 2 prominent American politicians in Alaska's wilderness underscored the state's remoteness and the risks accepted by anyone who ventures into its vast interior, whether by aircraft, boat, or on foot. Today, the mystery of N1812H remains one of Alaska's most enduring unsolved cases, a testament to the power of the wilderness to reclaim those who dare to challenge its dominion. The autumn wind carried the scent of salt and approaching winter across Nome's West Beach on September 28, 2021, when Florence Okpialuk made her final decision to disappear. The 36-year-old Alaska Native woman had been living in the weathered canvas tent for nearly 3 weeks, part of a growing encampment of homeless individuals who had found themselves displaced in Alaska's harsh economic reality. Florence had moved to Nome from the remote village of Wales, population 145, seeking better opportunities and medical care for her chronic health conditions. What she found instead was a housing crisis that left her camping on the windswept beach while waiting for assistance from overwhelmed social services agencies. Florence's journey to Nome reflected the struggles faced by many Alaska Native people who leave their traditional villages seeking employment, education, or healthcare in larger communities. Wales, situated on the western tip of the Seward Peninsula just 55 miles from the Siberian coast, offered few opportunities beyond subsistence hunting and fishing. The village had no running water, limited electricity, and healthcare services that required expensive flights to Nome or Anchorage for anything beyond basic first aid. Florence had worked as a village health aide in Wales, providing crucial medical services to her community. But chronic back pain from a childhood injury required specialized treatment that was simply unavailable in her home village. The tent city on Nome's West Beach had grown throughout the summer of 2021 as Alaska's ongoing housing shortage reached crisis levels. Nome, with its population of approximately 3,600 people, struggled to provide adequate housing for both longtime residents and newcomers seeking opportunities in the gold mining industry or government services. The beach encampment existed in a legal gray area, technically on public land but increasingly viewed as a public health and safety concern by local authorities. Florence's tent sat among 8 others, a small community of people who looked out for each other while navigating the complex bureaucracy of social services and housing assistance programs. Those who knew Florence described her as a quiet, thoughtful woman who had maintained her dignity despite difficult circumstances. She spoke fluent Inupiaq and English, serving as an informal translator and advocate for other Alaska Native people in the camp, who struggled with language barriers when dealing with government agencies. Her tent was organized and clean, containing a few personal belongings including family photographs, traditional beadwork supplies, and the medications she needed for her chronic conditions. She had been working with Nome's social services coordinator to secure permanent housing, but the waiting list for affordable apartments stretched for months or even years. On the Churdo evening of September 27th, several residents of the beach camp remembered Florence seeming more anxious than usual, pacing near her tent and making frequent trips to the payphone at the nearby gas station. She had mentioned waiting for an important phone call about a potential housing opportunity, expressing both hope and skepticism that anything would come of it. The other campers noticed she had packed her few belongings into a backpack, though she had not mentioned any plans to leave the area. That night, she shared coffee with her tent neighbors around a small campfire, speaking in Inupiaq about her grandmother's traditional stories and expressing worry about the approaching winter. The morning of September 28th dawned gray and windy, with temperatures in the low 40s and the promise of Alaska's brief autumn rapidly giving way to winter's grip. Florence's tent neighbors remember her being up early, sitting outside her shelter and watching the sunrise over Norton Sound, while drinking instant coffee from a metal camping cup. Around 8 in the morning, she told Martha Kokaluk, the woman whose tent was closest to hers, that she was going for a walk along the beach to clear her head and think about her options. She was wearing her usual outfit, dark jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, a gray hooded sweatshirt, and black sneakers that had seen better days. Martha would later tell investigators that Florence seemed different that morning, more focused and determined than she had appeared in recent days. The two women had developed a friendship based on their shared experience of displacement from traditional villages, and Martha recognized signs of stress and decision-making in her friend's demeanor. Florence had mentioned feeling overwhelmed by the complexity of the housing assistance application process and frustrated by the seemingly endless requirements and documentation needed to qualify for help. She expressed particular anxiety about the approaching winter, knowing that the beach camp would become uninhabitable once Nome's brutal weather arrived in earnest. When Florence failed to return to her tent by afternoon, Martha initially assumed she had found indoor shelter for the day or was dealing with paperwork at one of the social services offices. However, as evening approached and temperatures began dropping, The other camp residents grew concerned and began searching the immediate area. They found Florence's tent exactly as she had left it, with her sleeping bag, medications, and identification documents still inside. Most disturbingly, her heavy winter coat remained in the tent, despite the cooling weather that would have made the garment necessary for anyone planning to spend extended time outdoors. The search expanded the next morning when Martha contacted Nome Police Department to report her friend missing. Officer David Kokiok, himself an Alaska native who understood the cultural nuances of the situation, interviewed the other camp residents and began organizing a systematic search of Nome's limited road system and the extensive beach areas surrounding the community. The initial search focused on locations where Florence might have sought shelter, including abandoned buildings, storage facilities, and areas around the harbor where she might have tried to escape the increasingly harsh weather. Alaska State Troopers joined the search operation on the second day, bringing additional personnel and specialized equipment designed for wilderness searches in Alaska's challenging environment. Trooper Jeff Jacobson, who had extensive experience with missing persons cases involving Alaska Native individuals, coordinated with local tribal organizations and traditional knowledge holders who understood the area's geography and hazards. The search teams utilized all-terrain vehicles to cover the road system connecting Nome to surrounding communities, while volunteers on foot searched the extensive beach areas and tidal zones where someone might have encountered difficulties. The discovery that would haunt investigators came on October 3rd, nearly a week after Florence's disappearance. A group of volunteers searching the beach approximately 2 miles west of the tent camp found Florence's black sneakers, socks, and gray hooded sweatshirt neatly arranged on the sand just above the high tide line. The clothing appeared to have been deliberately placed rather than scattered by wind or waves, and there were no signs of struggle or violence in the surrounding area. Most puzzling was the fact that the items showed no evidence of prolonged exposure to the elements, despite having been missing for nearly a week during a period of harsh weather. The condition and arrangement of Florence's clothing created more questions than answers for investigators trying to understand what had happened during her walk along the beach. The sneakers were placed side by side as if someone had carefully removed them before entering the water, while the socks were tucked inside and the sweatshirt was folded nearby. However, extensive searches of the water and shoreline areas revealed no trace of Florence herself, despite conditions that should have preserved evidence of what had occurred. The discovery site was thoroughly documented and processed for forensic evidence, but investigators found no clear indication of whether Florence had entered the water voluntarily or encountered some other form of harm. The investigation into Florence's disappearance revealed the broader context of missing and murdered Indigenous women and people that has affected Alaska Native communities for generations. Alaska has one of the highest rates of missing Indigenous persons in the United States, with cases often receiving insufficient resources and attention from law enforcement agencies. Florence's case became part of a growing movement demanding better investigation and prevention efforts led by Alaska Native activists who argued that systemic discrimination and cultural misunderstanding contributed to the high number of unresolved cases affecting their communities. The search for Florence continued for weeks, involving helicopter overflights, marine patrols, and ground teams that covered hundreds of square miles of wilderness surrounding Nome. The Alaska Bureau of Investigation brought in specialized equipment, including sonar devices, to search the waters of Norton Sound and ground-penetrating radar to examine areas where Florence might have sought shelter or encountered harm. Despite these extensive efforts, investigators found no additional evidence that could explain what had happened to the missing woman or provide closure for her family and friends. Florence's family from Wales traveled to Nome to participate in the search efforts and advocate for continued investigation into her disappearance. Her sister Agnes Okpieluk spoke publicly about the need for better support services for Alaska Native people dealing with homelessness and the importance of treating missing persons cases with appropriate urgency regardless of the victim's housing status. The family organized traditional ceremonies to honor Florence and call for her safe return, drawing attention to the cultural dimensions of the case that outside investigators might not fully understand. The case attracted national attention when podcast investigator Payne Lindsay included Florence's disappearance in his examination of missing persons cases in Nome, Alaska. His investigation revealed the complex social and economic factors that had contributed to Florence's vulnerable situation, as well as the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies investigating cases involving Alaska Native individuals. The podcast brought renewed scrutiny to Nome's history of unexplained disappearances and the ongoing crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous people throughout Alaska. Today, Florence Okpieluk's disappearance remains officially classified as an open missing persons case, with Alaska State Troopers continuing to follow up on any new information that might explain what happened during her walk along Nome's West Beach. Her tent was eventually removed from the beach encampment, but her personal belongings were carefully preserved by investigators who hoped that someday new evidence might provide answers for her family. Florence's case serves as a sobering reminder of the vulnerabilities faced by Alaska Native people dealing with homelessness and displacement, and the urgent need for better support systems to prevent similar tragedies in America's most remote communities. The weathered fishermen gathered around the scarred wooden table at Port Protection's only saloon tell the story of Lucas Avery with the kind of hushed reverence reserved for the dead and the disappeared. It was a tale that had grown in the telling over the past 3 years, acquiring new details and darker implications with each retelling. But the core facts remained as solid and unforgiving as the granite cliffs that surrounded their remote southeast Alaska community. Lucas Avery, a 32-year-old maritime engineer from Portland, Oregon, had come to Port Protection in August of 2021 seeking the kind of authentic Alaskan experience that cruise ships and tour packages could never provide. Port Protection sits on the northern tip of Prince of Wales Island, a community so remote that it lacks basic infrastructure most Americans take for granted. No roads connect it to the outside world, no electrical grid powers its scattered homes, and no cell phone towers carry signals across the dense temperate rainforest that blankets the surrounding mountains. The 57 residents who call Port Protection home have chosen isolation deliberately, crafting lives built around subsistence fishing, hunting, and the kind of radical self-reliance that Alaska demands from those who venture beyond the reach of modern conveniences. Lucas had read about the community in outdoor magazines and planned his visit as the culminating adventure of a month-long solo journey through Southeast Alaska's Inside Passage. Lucas arrived aboard his 19-foot sea kayak on August 14th, having paddled north from Ketchikan through some of the most challenging waters in Southeast Alaska. The journey had taken him 2 weeks, navigating tidal currents that could reach 8 knots and threading his way between islands where brown bears outnumbered humans by significant margins. Local residents remember him as enthusiastic and well-prepared, carrying high-quality camping equipment and demonstrating the kind of competence on the water that came from years of experience kayaking the Pacific Northwest's demanding coastlines. He had established his camp on a small beach about a mile south of the main settlement, close enough to visit the community but far enough away to maintain the solitude he sought. The residents of Port Protection operate according to an informal but effective communication network based on marine radio frequencies that connect fishing boats, float planes, and the handful of homes equipped with radio equipment. Lucas had purchased a handheld marine radio specifically for his Alaska adventure, programming it with the frequencies used by local fishermen and the Coast Guard station in Ketchikan. During his first week in the area, he checked in regularly with the local radio net, providing updates on his location and plans while gathering information about weather conditions and potential hazards in the surrounding waters. His daily routine followed the rhythms established by experienced sea kayakers operating in Alaska's challenging maritime environment. Lucas would rise before dawn to take advantage of the calm conditions that often prevailed during early morning hours, when tidal currents were manageable and winds had not yet begun building. He spent his days exploring the intricate coastline of Prince of Wales Island, photographing wildlife and documenting his experiences in a waterproof journal that he planned to use for a book about solo wilderness travel. Evenings were devoted to camp maintenance, meal preparation, and radio communication with both local residents and his family back in Oregon. The weather forecast for August 22nd called for typical Southeast Alaska conditions. Overcast skies with periods of light rain and winds from the southeast at 10 to 15 knots. These were well within the parameters that Lucas had established for safe kayaking, and he announced his intention to explore the waters around nearby El Capitan Island during the morning radio net. Several local fishermen acknowledged his transmission and advised him to monitor Channel 16 for any changes in weather conditions, as Southeast Alaska's maritime climate could deteriorate rapidly without warning. The last confirmed communication from Lucas came at 11:47 that morning, when he radioed that he was approaching the northern shore of El Capitan Island and planned to explore several small coves before returning to his camp. When Lucas failed to participate in the evening radio net, Port Protection residents initially assumed he had experienced equipment failure or was simply out of range of the repeater station. However, by the following morning, concern began growing among the tight-knit community, especially when his planned return to camp went unnoticed. Gary Muhlberger, a longtime resident and experienced mariner, organized an informal search party using local fishing boats to check the areas where Lucas had planned to paddle. The searchers found Lucas's empty kayak floating upside down approximately 3 miles northeast of El Capitan Island, its emergency paddle missing and no sign of its occupant. The discovery of the overturned kayak triggered an immediate response from the United States Coast Guard station in Ketchikan, which dispatched a helicopter crew and additional vessels to search the waters around Prince of Wales Island. Coast Guard rescue swimmer Jake Morrison later described the conditions they encountered as challenging but not extreme, with 3 to 4 foot seas and visibility of approximately 2 miles. The search pattern expanded throughout the day to cover more than 50 square miles of water, utilizing both surface vessels and aircraft equipped with thermal imaging equipment capable of detecting a person in the water even in poor visibility conditions. The search operation revealed several disturbing details about Lucas's disappearance that puzzled both Coast Guard personnel and local residents familiar with sea kayaking safety procedures. The kayak's emergency paddle, which should have been secured to the deck with shock cord, was missing entirely, suggesting either equipment failure or that Lucas had been using it when whatever incident occurred took place. More puzzling was the absence of his personal flotation device, which experienced kayakers in Alaska waters typically wear at all times due to the lethally cold water temperatures that can cause incapacitation within minutes of immersion. Local residents familiar with the waters around El Capitan Island noted that the area where Lucas's kayak was found lay directly in the path of strong tidal currents that funnel between the island and the mainland shore. These currents, known locally as the El Capitan Rapids, can reach velocities of up to 6 knots during spring tides, creating standing waves and turbulent conditions that challenge even experienced kayakers. However, the tide tables for August 22nd showed relatively moderate current flow, and Lucas had demonstrated sufficient skill during his previous weeks in the area to handle such conditions under normal circumstances. The search continued for 5 days, involving Coast Guard aircraft from as far away as Sitka and volunteer vessels from communities throughout southeast Alaska. Searchers combed hundreds of miles of coastline, knowing that southeast Alaska's complex geography could carry debris or a person dozens of miles from the initial incident location. The search dogs brought in from Juneau lost any scent trail at the water's edge near Lucas's camp, confirming that he had departed by kayak as planned, but providing no additional information about what might have happened during his final paddle. Weather conditions during the search operation included periods of dense fog that limited visibility and occasionally grounded aircraft, highlighting the challenging environment that kayakers face in southeast Alaska waters. Local fishermen participating in the search efforts noted several anomalies during the days following Lucas's disappearance, including unusual behavior by marine mammals and birds that some attributed to the presence of orcas or other large predators in the area. While predator encounters involving sea kayakers are extremely rare, the remote waters around Prince of Wales Island support populations of both orcas and stellar sea lions that could potentially pose hazards to small watercraft. The official search was suspended after a week when Coast Guard commanders determined that survival in the 50-degree water temperatures was no longer possible, even for someone wearing appropriate cold water protection. However, port protection residents continued informal searches for several more weeks, checking remote beaches and coves where debris from Lucas's kayaking gear might have washed ashore. These efforts recovered several items of equipment that were positively identified as belonging to Lucas, including a waterproof storage bag containing his journal and camera, but provided no additional clues about the circumstances of his disappearance. The investigation into Lucas's disappearance examined several potential explanations, ranging from equipment failure and medical emergency to encounters with marine wildlife or extreme weather conditions. The National Transportation Safety Board conducted a preliminary investigation into the incident, interviewing local residents and examining the recovered kayak for evidence of structural failure or impact damage. However, the investigation was hampered by the absence of witnesses and the limited physical evidence available from the scene of the disappearance. Lucas's family traveled to port protection following the unsuccessful search, seeking closure and answers that the investigation had been unable to provide. His parents established a memorial fund supporting maritime safety education and search and rescue operations in southeast Alaska, while his sister Sarah continued advocating for improved emergency communication systems in remote areas where cell phone coverage was non-existent. The family also worked with the Coast Guard to improve notification procedures for solo kayakers operating in Alaska's remote waters. The story of Lucas Avery's disappearance became part of the folklore surrounding port protection, joining other tales of mariners who had challenged southeast Alaska's unforgiving waters and lost. Local residents speak of his case as a reminder that even experienced outdoors people can encounter hazards that prove insurmountable, and that Alaska's wilderness demands constant vigilance and respect from those who venture into its embrace. The empty beach where Lucas had established his final camp serves as an unofficial memorial to his memory, and a sobering reminder of the risks that accompany any attempt to experience Alaska's authentic wilderness. Today, Lucas Avery's disappearance remains classified as an unsolved missing persons case, though Coast Guard officials consider it most likely that he drowned following a kayaking accident in the challenging waters around El Capitan Island. His story continues to influence safety discussions among sea kayakers planning expeditions in southeast Alaska, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of emergency preparedness and communication systems when venturing into some of the most remote waters in North America. The mystery of what exactly happened during his final paddle may never be solved, But Lucas's legacy lives on in the improved safety practices adopted by other adventurers seeking to experience Alaska's maritime wilderness. The northern lights danced across the star-studded sky like ethereal ribbons of green and gold, casting an otherworldly glow over the remote backcountry lodge nestled deep in the Susitna Valley. Molly Winthrop pressed her face against the frosted window of her guest cabin, mesmerized by the aurora borealis display that had drawn her away from the warmth of Vermont's familiar forests to this wilderness sanctuary 60 miles northwest of Anchorage. At 43, the freelance nature photographer had built her career documenting wildlife and landscapes across North America, but Alaska's raw beauty represented the pinnacle of her artistic ambitions. The Aurora Lodge, a collection of rustic cabins accessible only by float plane or snow machine, promised the kind of pristine wilderness experience that modern tourism rarely provided. Molly had arrived at the lodge 3 days earlier aboard a vintage de Havilland Beaver float plane piloted by Jake Morrison, a taciturn Alaskan who had been flying passengers and supplies to remote locations for over 2 decades. The 40-minute flight from Anchorage had taken them over endless expanses of boreal forest punctuated by frozen lakes and mountain peaks that pierced the horizon like ancient sentinels. The Aurora Lodge sat on the shore of Mirror Lake, a pristine body of water surrounded by towering spruce trees, and accessible only during the brief summer months when aircraft could land on water or during winter when the frozen surface could support small planes equipped with skis. The lodge itself consisted of a main building housing the dining room, common area, and owner's quarters, surrounded by 8 individual guest cabins that could accommodate up to 20 visitors during peak season. During Molly's February visit, she was one of only 6 guests, sharing the remote sanctuary with 2 other photographers from California, a wildlife biologist from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and a retired couple from Minnesota who had been visiting the lodge annually for 15 years. The intimate group size created a family-like atmosphere where guests shared meals, stories, and the profound silence that characterized Alaska's winter wilderness. Lodge owner Robert Hendricks had purchased the property in 1998 after retiring from a career as a commercial airline pilot, drawn by the same pristine wilderness that attracted his guests. He had spent years upgrading the facilities while maintaining their rustic character, installing a diesel generator for electricity, a sophisticated water filtration system, and communication equipment that could reach emergency services in Anchorage despite the remote location. Hendricks prided himself on providing guests with authentic wilderness experiences while maintaining the safety standards that came from his aviation background and decades of living in Alaska's challenging environment. The evening of February 15th began like most others at the Aurora Lodge, with guests gathering in the main building after dinner to share stories and watch for aurora activity through the large windows that faced north toward the Brooks Range. Molly had spent the day photographing wildlife tracks in the fresh snow, documenting the intricate patterns left by snowshoe hares, ptarmigan, and the occasional wolf pack that traversed the frozen landscape. She had captured stunning images of ice formations along the lake shore and was planning to venture out later that night if the aurora forecast proved accurate. Weather conditions that evening were ideal for aurora viewing, with clear skies, minimal wind, and temperatures hovering around -20 degrees Fahrenheit. The National Weather Service had issued an aurora forecast predicting moderate to strong activity, and the lodge's location far from any light pollution offered unobstructed views of the northern horizon where the displays typically appeared most prominently. Molly had prepared her camera equipment earlier in the day, checking battery levels and ensuring her tripod was properly adjusted for the long exposures required to capture the aurora's ethereal movements. Around 10:30 that evening, the first faint green glow appeared on the northern horizon. gradually intensifying into the spectacular display that had drawn photographers from around the world to Alaska's winter wilderness. Molly bundled herself in multiple layers of insulation, gathered her camera gear, and stepped out into the crystalline night air that immediately began freezing the moisture in her breath. She established her photography position about 200 yards from her cabin near the lakeshore, where the aurora's reflection would create mirror images in the polished ice surface. The other guests had also ventured outside to witness the celestial display, with some choosing to watch from the heated comfort of the main lodge, while others braved the extreme cold to experience the aurora more intimately. Lodge owner Hendricks made his regular rounds to check on guests, reminding everyone about the dangers of extended cold exposure and advising them to return to heated buildings if they began experiencing any signs of hypothermia. The temperature had dropped to -25 degrees, cold enough to cause frostbite and exposed skin within minutes, and potentially fatal for anyone inadequately protected against the elements. Molly's photography session continued for nearly 2 hours as the aurora display reached peak intensity, with dancing curtains of light stretching from horizon to horizon in a cosmic performance that left her breathless with wonder. Her specialized cold weather camera equipment functioned perfectly in the extreme conditions, capturing image after image of the otherworldly phenomenon that had inspired countless legends among Alaska's indigenous peoples. She periodically returned to her cabin to warm her hands and check her equipment, but the spectacular display kept drawing her back outside despite the brutal cold. The last confirmed sighting of Molly occurred around 12:45 in the morning, when fellow photographer Dave Chen saw her adjusting her tripod near the lakeshore while the aurora activity began gradually diminishing. Chen had been photographing from a location closer to the main lodge and noticed Molly's silhouette against the starlit snow as she continued working despite the increasingly bitter cold. He considered approaching her to suggest returning to the warmth of the buildings, but decided against interrupting what appeared to be a productive photography session for someone experienced enough to manage her own safety in challenging conditions. When Molly failed to appear for breakfast the following morning, Hendricks knocked on her cabin door and discovered it unlocked with no sign that she had returned after her aurora photography session. Her camera equipment was missing, suggesting she had been carrying it when whatever incident occurred took place. The cabin showed no signs of disturbance, with her remaining gear neatly organized and her bed unslept in, indicating she had never returned from her late-night photography expedition. Most troubling was the absence of her heavy winter parka, which remained hanging in the cabin closet despite the lethal cold that would have made such protection essential for survival. The search for Molly began immediately, with Hendricks and his staff conducting an initial survey of the immediate area around the lodge while other guests checked the shoreline and nearby trails. Alaska State Troopers were notified by radio, but severe weather conditions prevented immediate helicopter support, leaving the initial search efforts to lodge personnel and guests who understood the urgency of finding someone exposed to Alaska's winter wilderness. The search was complicated by fresh snowfall that had begun around 3 in the morning, potentially covering any tracks or signs that might have indicated Molly's movements or the location where an incident had occurred. Professional search and rescue teams arrived the following day aboard snow machines and all-terrain vehicles, bringing specialized equipment and trained search dogs capable of detecting human scent even under challenging winter conditions. The teams systematically covered expanding search grids around the lodge, paying particular attention to the lakeshore area where Molly had been photographing and any terrain features that might have posed hazards during nighttime travel. Despite these extensive efforts, searchers found no trace of Molly or her camera equipment, an outcome that seemed impossible given the limited area where she could have traveled on foot in the extreme cold. The search expanded to include helicopter overflights once weather conditions improved, with aircraft equipped with thermal imaging technology that could detect heat signatures even in heavily forested terrain. Pilots familiar with Alaska's search and rescue operations noted that the pristine snow conditions should have preserved any evidence of Molly's movements, making the absence of tracks or disturbance signs particularly puzzling. The helicopter searches covered more than 50 square miles of wilderness surrounding the lodge, including remote valleys and ridgelines where someone might have wandered if disoriented by cold or equipment failure. As days passed without discovering any trace of Molly, theories about her disappearance ranged from cold weather accidents and wildlife encounters to more speculative explanations involving the mysterious phenomena that some associated with Alaska's remote wilderness areas. Lodge guests and staff reported unusual sounds during the nights following her disappearance, including distant howling that could have been wolves or wind, and unexplained lights that might have been aircraft or aurora activity. These accounts contributed to an atmosphere of unease that affected everyone at the remote lodge. The investigation revealed that Molly had been an experienced cold weather photographer who understood the dangers of Alaska's winter environment and typically took appropriate precautions when working in extreme conditions. Her camera equipment included backup batteries and cold weather protection systems that should have functioned reliably in the conditions she encountered that night. However, investigators noted that even experienced outdoors people could encounter unexpected equipment failures or medical emergencies that might lead to life-threatening situations in Alaska's unforgiving environment. The search for Molly continued for 2 weeks before being officially suspended, though lodge owner Hendricks and other local residents maintained informal searches throughout the remainder of the winter. Spring searches after the snow melted revealed no additional evidence that might explain her disappearance, leaving her family and friends without the closure they desperately sought. The Aurora Lodge continued operating, but Hendricks installed additional safety equipment and implemented more stringent guest monitoring procedures to prevent similar incidents. Today, Molly Winthrop's disappearance remains an unsolved mystery that has become part of the folklore surrounding Alaska's remote wilderness lodges. Her case serves as a sobering reminder that even experienced outdoors people can encounter hazards that prove insurmountable in Alaska's challenging environment, where help may be hours or days away and where weather conditions can change from manageable to life-threatening within minutes. The dancing aurora that drew her to that frozen lake shore continues to attract photographers and adventure seekers. But Molly's story ensures that visitors understand the respect that Alaska's wilderness demands from all who venture into its embrace. The mist hung heavy over Resurrection Bay as the massive Norwegian Star glided toward the port of Seward, its 15 decks carrying 3,400 passengers eager to experience the raw majesty of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula. Among them stood Anthony Rios, a 51-year-old civil engineer from Albuquerque, New Mexico, who had spent months planning this Alaskan cruise as a celebration of his recent divorce settlement and a chance to reconnect with the wilderness photography that had been his passion before marriage and career demands consumed his time. He leaned against the ship's railing on Deck 7, watching the towering peaks of the Chugach Mountains emerge from the morning fog like ancient guardians protecting the secrets of America's last frontier. Anthony had booked the cruise independently, seeking solitude and adventure after 23 years of marriage that had ended amicably but left him questioning the direction of his life. His ex-wife, Patricia, had received their house in Santa Fe's foothills, while Anthony kept their shared photography equipment and the freedom to pursue the travel adventures they had always postponed for more practical concerns. The Norwegian Star's 7-day inside passage itinerary promised glacier viewing, wildlife encounters, and most importantly for Anthony, access to some of Alaska's most spectacular hiking opportunities during the ship's port calls in Ketchikan, Juneau, and Seward. The ship docked in Seward at 6:30 that morning, with passengers scheduled to disembark for various shore excursions ranging from luxury coach tours to challenging backcountry adventures. Anthony had researched the area extensively, ultimately choosing a guided glacier trek to the terminus of Exit Glacier, located within Kenai Fjords National Park about 10 miles from downtown Seward. The 8-hour excursion would take participants through temperate rainforest, across rocky moraines, and finally onto the glacier itself, offering unparalleled opportunities for the landscape photography that had drawn Anthony to Alaska in the first place. The tour group consisted of 12 passengers led by Marcus Peterson, a certified wilderness guide with 15 years of experience leading visitors through Alaska's challenging terrain. Peterson briefed the group on safety protocols, weather conditions, and the physical demands of glacier travel, emphasizing that participants needed to maintain visual contact with guides at all times, due to the potential for rapidly changing conditions and hidden crevasses. Anthony impressed the guide with his quality camera equipment and his questions about optimal shooting positions, demonstrating both preparation and respect for the environment they would be entering. The initial portion of the trek proceeded smoothly, with the group hiking established trails through dense Sitka spruce forest, while Peterson provided commentary about the area's natural history and the dramatic retreat of Exit Glacier over the past century. Anthony hung back from the main group periodically to capture images of old-growth trees draped in moss and the occasional glimpse of snow-capped peaks through the forest canopy. His fellow hikers were a mix of fitness levels and ages, but all seemed capable of handling the moderate terrain that characterized the approach to the glacier. The group reached the glacier's terminus around noon, where they paused for lunch while marveling at the massive ice formation that had carved the valley over thousands of years. Anthony was particularly fascinated by the glacier's constantly changing surface, where ice flows created dramatic crevasses and ice caves that captured light in spectacular ways. He asked Peterson about accessing better photography positions, expressing particular interest in the lateral moraines that bordered the glacier, and offered elevated vantage points for capturing the ice field's full scope. Peterson agreed to lead a smaller subgroup, including Anthony and 3 other experienced hikers, to a rocky outcrop about a quarter-mile from the main glacier viewing area. The guide emphasized that this advanced position required careful attention to footing and weather conditions, as afternoon temperature changes could create unstable ice conditions and sudden fog banks that reduced visibility to mere yards. Anthony assured the guide that he understood the risks and would follow all safety protocols while pursuing his photography objectives. The advanced photography group spent approximately 90 minutes on the rocky outcrop, with Anthony capturing what he later described to fellow hikers as some of the most spectacular glacier images he had ever taken. The lighting conditions were perfect, with partial cloud cover creating dramatic contrasts between the blue-white ice and the surrounding granite peaks. Anthony's enthusiasm was evident to other group members who noticed him moving confidently among the rocks while seeking optimal shooting angles for his increasingly heavy camera bag. The group began their return journey around 3:15, with Peterson leading them back toward the main trail system that would take them to the tour bus pickup location in Seward. The weather had remained stable throughout the day, with temperatures in the mid-40s and only light winds that posed no challenges for experienced hikers. Anthony continued photographing during the return journey, occasionally asking the group to pause while he captured images of wildlife or particularly striking landscape features along the trail. The first indication that something was wrong came when the group reached the trail junction, where they should have regrouped with other tour participants. A quick head count revealed that Anthony was no longer with the group, though none of the other hikers could recall exactly when they had last seen him. Peterson immediately implemented emergency protocols, dividing the remaining, hikers into search teams while using his satellite communication device to contact park rangers and the Norwegian Star's shore excursion coordinators. The initial search focused on the route between the rocky outcrop and the trail junction, covering approximately half a mile of varied terrain that included both established trails and off-trail areas where Anthony might have wandered while seeking photography opportunities. Search teams called his name repeatedly while looking for any signs of his passage, including dropped equipment or disturbed vegetation that might indicate where he had left the main group. The search was complicated by the terrain's complex topography, which included numerous side valleys and rock formations where someone could easily become separated from their companions. Park rangers arrived within 2 hours, bringing additional personnel and specialized search equipment, including avalanche beacons that could detect electronic devices at considerable distances. The rangers established a command post at the Exit Glacier Visitor Center while coordinating with the Coast Guard, Alaska State Troopers, and volunteer search and rescue teams from the Seward area. The Norwegian Star delayed its departure while ship personnel contacted Anthony's emergency contacts and coordinated with search coordinators about extending the search window. The search operation expanded dramatically on the second day, with helicopter crews from the Alaska National Guard joining ground teams that had worked through the night despite challenging weather conditions. The helicopters carried thermal imaging equipment capable of detecting human heat signatures through forest canopies and cloud cover, technology that had proven successful in previous Alaskan search operations. However, the complex terrain around Exit Glacier presented unique challenges for both ground and aerial searchers, with numerous valleys and rock formations that could hide someone from detection. Search teams discovered Anthony's camera on the third day, found approximately 1 mile from where he had last been seen by fellow tour participants. The camera was located in a steep-sided ravine that had been carved by glacial meltwater, sitting on rocks about 30 feet below the rim where Anthony might have been photographing the scenic gorge. The camera appeared undamaged and contained hundreds of images from Anthony's Alaska cruise, including spectacular shots taken during his final glacier trek that documented his movements up until the time of his disappearance. The discovery location raised troubling questions about what had happened to Anthony after he became separated from his tour group. The ravine where his camera was found offered dramatic photography opportunities with a small waterfall and interesting rock formations that would have appealed to someone seeking unique landscape images. However, the steep terrain would have required extreme caution to access safely, and the loose rock surfaces could have created hazardous conditions for anyone attempting to climb down for better shooting positions. Analysis of the images stored on Anthony's camera revealed a progression of photographs taken throughout the day, with the final images captured at the rocky outcrop where the tour group had spent time before beginning their return journey. Camera timestamp data suggested that Anthony had continued photographing after the group began moving, potentially explaining how he had become separated from his companions. The final images showed no signs of distress or emergency conditions, suggesting that whatever incident occurred had happened after Anthony stopped taking photographs. The search continued for 8 days, involving more than 50 personnel and covering over 20 square miles of challenging wilderness terrain. Searchers utilized trained search dogs, helicopter overflights, ground-penetrating radar, and even divers who explored deep pools in the glacial streams where Anthony might have fallen. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Anthony himself was ever found, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about what had happened to the experienced hiker and photographer. The Norwegian Star eventually continued its itinerary after coordinating with Anthony's family and ensuring that all possible search resources remained committed to finding him. Cruise line representatives worked with law enforcement agencies to interview other passengers who might have interacted with Anthony during the voyage, seeking any information that might explain his disappearance or provide leads for the ongoing investigation. The ship's security footage confirmed Anthony's participation in the shore excursion but provided no additional insights into his state of mind or intentions. Today, Anthony Rios remains officially listed as a missing person, with Alaska State Troopers maintaining an open case file that includes all evidence collected during the extensive search operation. His disappearance has influenced safety protocols for glacier tours in the Seward area, with guides now implementing more stringent procedures for maintaining group cohesion and accounting for all participants throughout challenging terrain. The mystery of what happened to Anthony in those final moments serves as a sobering reminder that Alaska's wilderness can claim even experienced visitors who understand and respect its dangers, leaving families and investigators searching for answers that may never come. The camera's memory card would later reveal that Samantha Harding had captured her final photographs at 11:47 in the evening on September 3rd, 2022. As the aurora borealis painted the Arctic sky in shades of emerald and violet above the frozen tundra surrounding Utqiagvik, Alaska. The 29-year-old travel blogger from Baltimore had spent 6 days documenting life in America's northernmost community, formerly known as Barrow, sharing her experiences with an online following of nearly 40,000 subscribers who eagerly awaited her posts from some of the world's most remote destinations. Her last Instagram story, posted just hours before she vanished, showed her bundled in Arctic gear beside a frozen river, promising her followers the most spectacular Northern Lights footage they had ever seen. Samantha had built her reputation as an adventure travel blogger by seeking out destinations that other content creators avoided, places where luxury accommodations and reliable internet connections gave way to authentic cultural experiences and natural phenomena that could only be witnessed in the world's most isolated corners. Her blog, titled Wandering Beyond Borders, documented journeys to Mongolia's Gobi Desert, Iceland's volcanic highlands, and the remote villages of northern Norway. Alaska represented the culmination of her Arctic exploration series, a months-long project that had taken her from the temperate rainforests of southeast Alaska to the windswept tundra of the North Slope. The journey to Utqiagvik required careful planning and significant financial investment, as the community sits more than 300 miles north of the Arctic Circle and can only be reached by commercial flights from Anchorage or Fairbanks. Samantha had spent weeks coordinating with local guides and cultural liaisons, ensuring that her documentation of Inupiaq traditional life would be respectful and accurate. She had obtained the necessary permits for drone photography and invested in specialized Arctic camera equipment designed to function in temperatures that could drop to -40 degrees Fahrenheit even during the brief summer months. Her accommodation at the Top of the World Hotel placed her in the heart of Utqiagvik, a community of approximately 4,000 people who had adapted to life in one of Earth's most challenging environments. The hotel served as a gathering place for visitors ranging from climate researchers and oil industry workers to the occasional adventure tourist willing to pay premium prices for authentic Arctic experiences. Samantha quickly established relationships with local residents, including traditional whaling captain Moses Kanguk and his family, who agreed to share their knowledge of subsistence hunting and the cultural traditions that sustained Inupiaq communities through countless generations of Arctic survival. Her daily routine involved early morning photography sessions to capture the unique quality of Arctic light, followed by interviews with community members about their adaptation to climate change and the preservation of traditional knowledge. Samantha's blog posts from Utqiagvik reveal genuine respect for the challenges facing Arctic communities, avoiding the sensationalism that characterized many outsider accounts of life in extreme environments. She documented the construction techniques that allowed buildings to survive on permanently frozen ground, the complex logistics required to supply a community accessible only by air or sea, and the sophisticated traditional knowledge that enabled successful subsistence hunting in conditions that would quickly prove fatal to unprepared visitors. September 3rd marked the beginning of Samantha's final planned expedition, a solo photography journey to document the landscape surrounding Utqiagvik during the brief transition period between the endless daylight of Arctic summer and the approaching polar night. She had rented an all-terrain vehicle from a local outfitter, equipped with GPS navigation, emergency communication equipment, and survival supplies appropriate for extended travel on the tundra. Her planned route would take her approximately 15 miles southeast of town to the banks of the Mead River, where she hoped to capture images of caribou migration and the dramatic interplay between tundra vegetation and the approaching winter freeze. The weather forecast called for clear skies and temperatures in the low 20s, ideal conditions for the aurora photography that had drawn Samantha to Utqiagvik during the autumn equinox period when geomagnetic activity typically peaks. She departed the hotel around 4 in the afternoon, allowing sufficient time to reach her planned camping location and establish her photography equipment before darkness provided optimal conditions for capturing the northern lights. Her GPS device was programmed with waypoints marking her intended route and emergency shelter locations, while her satellite communicator provided two-way messaging capability with search and rescue coordinators in Anchorage. Local residents who saw Samantha departing remembered her enthusiasm about the planned photography session, as well as her careful preparation and respect for the Arctic environment that had claimed the lives of numerous visitors over the years. She carried redundant navigation systems, emergency shelter, and sufficient food and fuel for 3 days, following the survival protocols that experienced Arctic travelers consider essential for any journey beyond the immediate vicinity of permanent settlements. Her all-terrain vehicle was equipped with tracks rather than wheels, providing the flotation necessary for travel across tundra that could be deceptively soft, despite appearing solid and stable. The last confirmed GPS ping from Samantha's devices occurred at 10:32 that evening, placing her approximately 12 miles southeast of Utqiagvik, near the planned photography location beside the Mead River. The signal indicated normal device function and suggested that Samantha had successfully reached her intended destination and was presumably beginning her aurora photography session. Weather conditions at the time remained within acceptable parameters, with clear skies, light winds, and aurora activity that would have provided the spectacular displays she had traveled thousands of miles to document. When Samantha failed to return to Utqiagvik by her planned departure time the following afternoon, hotel staff contacted local authorities who initiated emergency protocols for overdue travelers in the Arctic environment. The North Slope Borough Search and Rescue Coordinator assembled a team of volunteers familiar with the terrain between Utqiagvik and the Mead River, while Alaska state troopers prepared to deploy additional resources if the initial search efforts proved unsuccessful. The urgency of the situation was heightened by weather forecasts predicting deteriorating conditions that could make search operations extremely dangerous for both the missing person and rescue personnel. The search team located Samantha's abandoned all-terrain vehicle around noon on September 5th, approximately 2 miles from the last GPS coordinates and showing no obvious signs of mechanical failure or accident. The vehicle was properly parked and secured with Samantha's emergency supplies still inside, along with most of her camera equipment. However, her primary camera, tripod, and cold weather clothing were missing, suggesting that she had departed the vehicle voluntarily for what was intended to be a temporary photography expedition. Most puzzling was the absence of any tracks leading away from the vehicle, as the soft tundra should have preserved clear evidence of her direction of travel. The discovery of Samantha's camera equipment came 2 days later, found by searchers approximately 1 mile northwest of her vehicle near a small lake that offered dramatic foreground elements for aurora photography. The camera and tripod were positioned as if Samantha had been actively photographing when something caused her to abandon the equipment. The camera's memory card contained hundreds of images documenting her journey to Utqiagvik, including spectacular aurora photographs taken throughout the night of September 3rd that demonstrated both her technical skill and artistic vision as a photographer. Analysis of the final images revealed increasingly spectacular aurora displays that would have required Samantha to remain outside for extended periods while adjusting camera settings and composition. The timestamps indicated continuous photography activity until 11:47, when the image sequence abruptly stopped with no obvious technical malfunction or environmental factor that would have prevented continued shooting. The final photograph showed a particularly dramatic aurora curtain stretching across the entire sky, suggesting that conditions remained excellent for photography when whatever incident occurred took place. Search efforts expanded to include helicopter overflights equipped with thermal imaging technology, ground teams using trained search dogs, and underwater search specialists who examined the lake near where Samantha's camera was found. The search covered more than 100 square miles of tundra, utilizing techniques developed specifically for Arctic search and rescue operations, where vast distances and extreme weather conditions create unique challenges. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Samantha herself was ever discovered, leaving investigators with more questions than answers about her final hours in the Arctic wilderness. The investigation attracted attention from Samantha's substantial online following, with her blog subscribers and social media followers organizing their own research efforts to analyze her final posts and GPS data for any clues that professional searchers might have overlooked. Online investigators noted anomalies in her final photographs, including unexplained light sources that did not appear to be consistent with aurora phenomena. Though image analysis experts could not conclusively determine whether these represented technical artifacts or actual environmental conditions at the photography site. Local Inupiaq elders shared traditional knowledge about the dangers that could befall travelers in the Arctic landscape, including sudden weather changes, disorientation caused by the featureless terrain, and the psychological effects of extended exposure to the profound silence and isolation that characterize the tundra environment. The elders emphasized that even experienced outdoors people could encounter conditions that proved fatal within minutes, particularly during the transitional seasons when ice conditions and weather patterns could change rapidly. The search for Samantha Harding was officially suspended after 2 weeks, though North Slope Borough authorities maintained the case as an active missing persons investigation. Her family established a scholarship fund supporting Arctic research and traditional knowledge preservation, while her blog posts from Utqiagvik continued to serve as educational resources about Inupiaq culture and the challenges facing Arctic communities. The mystery of her disappearance became part of the folklore surrounding Alaska's vast wilderness, a reminder that even the most prepared adventurers must respect the power of forces beyond human control in America's final frontier. Today, Samantha's story serves as both inspiration and warning for adventure travelers seeking authentic experiences in remote destinations. Her respectful documentation of Inupiaq culture and her obvious preparation for Arctic travel demonstrate the careful approach required for responsible exploration, while her disappearance underscores the reality that Alaska's wilderness can claim even those who understand and respect its dangers. The northern lights continue to dance over the tundra where she vanished, witnessed now by the few travelers bold enough to venture into the Arctic darkness, carrying with them the sobering knowledge that some who seek to capture nature's most spectacular displays may become part of the landscape they came to document. Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we uncover 8 of the most disturbing true small-town horror stories that shattered communities and destroyed lives forever. These accounts are not pulled from internet forums or secondhand retellings, but from the personal testimonies of individuals whose quiet lives became living nightmares. Each story reveals the darkness hiding behind small-town facades, from predators using local Facebook groups to hunt their victims, to investment schemes that were covers for something far more sinister. We have mechanic Anthony, whose late-night work shifts put him in a serial killer's crosshairs, teacher Rachel, whose evening walk home became a targeted attack, and Ranger Brianna, whose forest encounters revealed something inhuman stalking her community. The testimonies have been carefully verified through police reports and court documents, ensuring every detail maintains its disturbing authenticity, while names and specific locations have been altered to protect those who survived these ordeals. If you have not yet subscribed to Buried Files, join our community of truth seekers and activate the notification bell so you never miss when we expose the horror hiding in plain sight. Leave a comment below sharing your own small-town experiences, or tell us which story disturbed you most deeply. I never thought my evening walk home would put me in the crosshairs of organized predators. I was 28, teaching third grade at Millerville Elementary in our small Montana town, population just under 4,000 people. The kind of place where parents still let their children ride bicycles after dark, and where the biggest crime of the year was usually teenagers spray painting the water tower. My life was simple but fulfilling, teaching bright 8-year-olds during the day and hiking the mountain trails that surrounded our valley on weekends. That particular Friday evening in late August, I had met my friend Brianna at Murphy's Diner for our monthly dinner, something we had been doing since we both moved to Millerville 3 years earlier. She worked as a park ranger at the state recreation area, and I always enjoyed hearing her stories about wildlife encounters and the tourists who thought they could hike 15 miles in sandals. The diner sat on Main Street, only about a 15-minute walk from my rental house on Oakwood Drive. I always enjoyed the stroll home, especially on warm summer nights when the air smelled like pine, and the mountains created dramatic silhouettes against the darkening sky. Around 9:30 p.m., I hugged Brianna goodbye in the parking lot and started my walk home along Hillcrest Road. The street was poorly lit, just a few street lamps every couple hundred feet. But I had walked this route countless times and knew every pothole and crack in the sidewalk. The Hendersons' golden retriever would usually bark from behind their fence when I passed. Mrs. Foster's wind chimes would tinkle in her front yard, and old Mr. Peterson would often be sitting on his porch, raising a hand in greeting. That night, though, most houses were already dark, their occupants probably watching television or getting ready for bed. I remember feeling completely at peace, thinking about the lesson plans I needed to finish that weekend, humming some tune I had heard on the radio earlier. The air was still warm but carried that hint of approaching fall. And I was wearing my favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny flowers that my mother had given me for my birthday. I was about halfway home, passing the stretch where Hillcrest curves slightly near the old oak tree that everyone calls the wishing tree because kids have been tying ribbons to it for decades. The sidewalk ended there, so I had to walk on the shoulder of the road, but there was usually so little traffic at that hour that it never bothered me. That is when I heard the engine. Not the steady hum of a car maintaining speed, but this aggressive, uneven roaring that kept surging and dropping like someone was randomly stomping on the gas pedal. I turned my head to look back and saw headlights weaving across both lanes about 200 yards away, moving way too fast for this narrow road. The vehicle, a dark pickup truck based on the height of the lights, kept drifting from one side to the other, tires squealing every time it corrected too hard. My first thought was not even about my own safety. I actually worried the driver might hit the wishing tree, which sounds ridiculous now. But that tree had been a landmark in our community for generations. But then I realized the truck was accelerating, really gunning it on this straight stretch, and it was veering toward my side of the road. The headlights swung wide to the left, then overcorrected sharply to the right, heading straight for the shoulder where I was walking. Everything happened in maybe 3 seconds, but my brain recorded it in this strange, stretched-out way. I tried to jump toward the drainage ditch, but my sandal caught on a piece of loose gravel and I stumbled. The truck was so close I could see the bugs splattered on the grill, could smell the hot engine and burnt rubber. The driver, I glimpsed his face for just an instant through the windshield, had this slack, unfocused expression, his mouth hanging open, one hand loosely on the wheel while the other held what looked like a beer bottle. His eyes were not even looking at the road. They were glazed, staring at nothing, but there was something calculated about his positioning that made my blood freeze even in that split second of terror. This was not just drunk driving. This was deliberate. The impact came from behind and to my left, the truck's front bumper catching me at hip level and launching me forward like I weighed nothing. I remember the sensation of flying, my dress billowing up, one sandal flying off, and thinking absurdly that I needed to cover myself, that people might see my underwear. Then I hit the pavement hard, my right shoulder taking the initial impact before I rolled and skidded across the asphalt. The pain did not register immediately. There was just this overwhelming wrongness, like my body had become a jumbled puzzle with pieces forced into the wrong spots. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel wetness spreading across the right side of my face. The truck had not stopped. I heard it screech around the next curve, metal scraping against something, probably the guardrail, before the engine noise faded into the distance. I tried to move to get up, but my right leg would not respond at all. When I looked down, I saw it was bent at an angle that made no anatomical sense, my foot facing completely backward. My right arm was trapped underneath me, and when I tried to pull it free, white-hot agony shot through my shoulder and chest. I could hear myself making these awful whimpering sounds like a wounded animal, but I could not stop. The yellow sundress my mother had given me was torn and soaking up blood from a dozen different places, the tiny flowers disappearing under spreading red stains. I lay there on the warm asphalt, feeling it burning against my exposed skin, trying to call for help, but only managing these raspy whispers. My phone had been in my purse, which was now scattered somewhere in the darkness. I could see my wallet about 10 feet away, my driver's license facing up, and somehow that detail felt important, like I needed people to know who I was when they found me. The first car to arrive was driven by Anthony, a local farmer who had been coming home late from checking on his cattle. He found me around 10:15 p.m. and immediately called for an ambulance while covering me with a blanket from his truck. "Do not try to move," he kept saying, though moving was the last thing my body wanted to do anyway. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, a response time that probably saved my life given the internal injuries I had sustained. They stabilized me on scene before transporting me to the regional hospital in Billings, a 40-minute helicopter ride that I barely remember except for the steady thrum of rotors and someone holding my hand. The next few days were a haze of surgeries and pain medication, but one conversation stands out with crystal clarity. Detective Benjamin Walsh from the state police came to interview me while I was still in intensive care, asking detailed questions about the truck, the driver, and whether I had noticed anything unusual in the days leading up to the incident. "This was not random," Detective Walsh explained during our second meeting. "We have been tracking a pattern of similar incidents across 3 states. Young women, usually teachers or healthcare workers, walking alone in small mountain communities. The profile is very specific, and the targeting appears to be deliberate. The investigation revealed that my attack was part of a coordinated operation involving at least 4 men, who had been systematically targeting isolated women in small towns throughout Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. They would scout communities for weeks, identifying women who walked alone at predictable times, learning their routines and planning attacks that appeared to be drunk driving accidents. The truck that hit me had been stolen from a ranch outside Missoula 2 days earlier. The driver, whose name was Ryan Marcus, had a lengthy criminal record including assault and trafficking charges. But most terrifyingly, they found detailed files in his hotel room containing photographs of me taken over several weeks, including images of my classroom, my house, and my regular walking route. Ryan and his accomplices had been in Millerville for over a month, posing as seasonal construction workers while gathering intelligence on potential victims. They had targeted me specifically because my evening walks were predictable and because the stretch of Hillcrest Road near the wishing tree provided the perfect location for an attack that could be dismissed as a drunk driving accident. The FBI arrested the entire network 6 weeks after my attack, preventing what investigators believe would have been escalating violence against women throughout the region. Ryan received 25 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, revealing a trafficking operation that had been using small towns as hunting grounds for victims who could be easily isolated and transported. I spent 4 months in physical therapy learning to walk again with a permanently damaged right leg and ongoing nerve damage in my shoulder. The school district held my position, and my students made cards that covered every wall of my hospital room. But I knew I could not return to Millerville. The idea of walking those streets again, of passing the wishing tree where my life had nearly ended, was more than I could psychologically handle. I moved to Seattle 6 months after the attack, taking a teaching position in a large urban school where anonymity felt like protection, and where I could take public transportation instead of walking alone. The transition was difficult, leaving behind the mountain community that had felt like home, but necessary for my mental health and long-term recovery. Brianna still sends updates about Millerville, always careful to avoid mentioning Hillcrest Road or the wishing tree. The town installed better lighting throughout the residential areas and organized neighborhood watch programs. But the sense of safety that had defined life there was permanently altered by the knowledge that predators had been living among them for weeks. I know now that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just more isolated and therefore more vulnerable to organized predators who understand how to exploit trust and routine. My evening walk, which had been a simple pleasure for 3 years, was actually a carefully observed pattern that nearly cost me my life. The investigation also revealed something that still gives me nightmares. The network had been planning to escalate beyond hit-and-run attacks. In Ryan's notes, agents found detailed plans for abductions, including a timeline that suggested I had less than a week before they moved from surveillance to direct action. My attack was actually the beginning of their exit strategy, not the culmination of their plan. Most people can walk home from dinner without calculating escape routes or wondering if the vehicles behind them pose a threat. But I learned that some predators study their victims with the patience of scientists, learning routines and vulnerabilities before striking with precision that makes their crimes appear random when they are actually the result of weeks of careful planning. I never thought my neighbor's farm equipment business would be connected to murder. I was 45, working as an insurance adjuster in Millerville, a small farming community of 3,800 people in central Kansas where everybody knew everybody's business and nothing exciting ever happened. The kind of place where the biggest news of the week was usually someone's prize steer getting loose or the high school football team making it to regionals. My wife Nicole and I had lived there for 15 years, and Justin lived 3 houses down from us for most of that time. Justin was the kind of neighbor you could count on for anything. When the tornado took out half our garage in 2019, He was there the next morning with his tools and lumber, working alongside me to rebuild it without being asked. When Nicole was in the hospital for her emergency appendectomy, Justin brought casseroles for a week and never mentioned the cost or trouble. He was at our wedding anniversary party, our 4th of July barbecues, and every single one of our Christmas Eve gatherings since we moved to Millerville. His farm equipment leasing company seemed like the natural evolution of someone who had grown up around machinery and understood what local farmers needed. Justin had taken over his father's old auto repair shop on Highway 36 and transformed it into something bigger, more modern, catering to the agricultural community that formed the backbone of our local economy. Tractors, combines, irrigation systems, everything a modern farming operation required but might not be able to afford outright. So when Justin approached me at Murphy's Diner on a Tuesday in September, sliding into the booth across from me with that familiar grin, I had absolutely no reason to be suspicious. "I've got a business proposition for you," he said, ordering coffee from Diane behind the counter, who had been serving the same route for 20 years. "Something that could help both of us out financially." The pitch was straightforward and appealing. Justin's equipment leasing business was expanding rapidly, but he needed capital to purchase more inventory to meet demand. He was offering investment opportunities to select local people, promising returns of 15% annually on investments of $10,000 or more. "I'd rather work with people I trust than go to some bank in Topeka that doesn't understand agriculture," he explained. The numbers made sense based on what I knew about farming and equipment costs. 15% was higher than anything we could get from CDs or savings accounts, but not so high that it seemed unrealistic given the margins in agricultural equipment. Justin showed me spreadsheets on his laptop, detailed projections for growth, testimonials from farmers who were already leasing equipment and expanding their operations thanks to his financing options. "I've already got commitments from Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander," he mentioned, naming 3 other neighbors, whose financial judgment I respected. "We're keeping this local, people who understand the community and want to see it prosper." The idea of being part of something that would strengthen Millerville's economy while providing financial security for Nicole and me was exactly the kind of opportunity we had been hoping to find. Nicole and I discussed it over dinner that night, weighing the pros and cons while our 15-year-old son Anthony did homework at the kitchen table. The investment would represent most of our savings, the money we had been accumulating for Anthony's college education and our own retirement. But 15% returns would actually accelerate those goals significantly if Justin's projections proved accurate. We decided to invest $12,000, essentially our entire emergency fund plus the money earmarked for a new roof. Justin came to our house the following Saturday evening to finalize the paperwork, bringing contracts that looked professional and legitimate, complete with legal language about terms, conditions, and responsibilities. Nicole signed as co-investor, and we shook hands on what felt like the beginning of financial security for our family. The first quarterly payment arrived exactly on schedule in December, a check for $450 that represented our share of the profits from Justin's expanding business. The second payment came in March, right on time, and Justin even included a handwritten note thanking us for our confidence and updating us on recent equipment purchases and lease agreements with farms throughout the county. But the June payment never arrived. When I called Justin's office, his secretary Kayla said he was out of town visiting equipment suppliers and would return my call within the week. The week stretched into 2 weeks, then 3, and my calls were increasingly met with evasive responses about Justin being busy with major deals that required his immediate attention. I drove past Justin's property on Highway 36 one Thursday evening in July and noticed that the lot, which had been full of tractors and combines just months earlier, was completely empty. The building looked abandoned, windows dark. No vehicles in the parking area that had always been bustling with farmers and mechanics during business hours. A for lease sign was posted near the road, something that made my stomach clench with the first real understanding that our investment might be in serious trouble. The next morning, I went to the county courthouse to research property records, hoping to find information about Justin's business operations or perhaps a forwarding address. What I discovered was far worse than simple business failure. The building on Highway 36 had been sold 3 months earlier to a development company from Wichita. Justin no longer owned any property in Millerville, and according to the clerk, he had not filed any business licenses or tax documents for his equipment leasing company in over a year. I called Benjamin, Ryan, and Alexander, the other neighbors Justin had mentioned as investors. None of them had invested any money. In fact, Ryan had never even been approached about the investment opportunity, and Alexander said Justin had only mentioned it in passing without providing any details or paperwork. The testimonials and commitments Justin had described were complete fabrications designed to make me feel confident about investing. Nicole took the news about our financial loss with the kind of quiet devastation that was worse than anger or tears. We had trusted someone we had known for 15 years, someone who had eaten at our table and helped us through difficult times. The betrayal felt more personal and more painful than simple fraud, because it destroyed our faith in the community relationships that had defined our lives in Millerville. But the story became infinitely more horrifying when the FBI arrived in town 6 weeks later. Special Agent Sarah Chen knocked on our door on a Tuesday morning in August, asking questions about our financial relationship with Justin and whether we had noticed anything unusual about his business operations or personal behavior. The questions seemed routine until she asked whether we had visited any of the properties Justin claimed to own or lease for equipment storage. Agent Chen explained that Justin was suspected of running a sophisticated Ponzi scheme that had defrauded investors across 3 states of over $2 million. But the investigation had uncovered something much darker than financial fraud. Several of the properties Justin claimed to own for equipment storage were actually sites where human remains had been discovered, and he was now considered a suspect in multiple homicides dating back several years. The farmhouse 40 miles outside Millerville, where Justin had supposedly stored combines and irrigation equipment, was actually a burial ground for at least 5 people who had been reported missing from small farming communities across Kansas and Nebraska. The FBI had found skeletal remains, personal belongings, and evidence suggesting the victims had been killed execution-style before being buried in hastily dug graves behind the abandoned barn. Agent Chen showed me photographs of the victims, asking whether I recognized any of them or whether Justin had ever mentioned knowing people from outside Millerville. The faces were unfamiliar, but the ages and backgrounds were chillingly similar. All were middle-aged residents of small towns. All had reported missing persons cases that had gone cold within weeks, and all had last been seen meeting with someone about investment opportunities or business deals. The investigation revealed that Justin's equipment leasing company had never actually owned any equipment. The tractors and combines I had seen on his lot were either stolen or temporarily borrowed from legitimate dealers for the purpose of maintaining his cover story. The farmers who had supposedly provided testimonials about his services were either fictional or had been coerced into providing false statements through threats or intimidation. Most terrifyingly, the FBI discovered that Justin had been using investor meetings to identify potential victims for something much worse than financial fraud. Agent Chen explained that several of the murder victims had initially been approached about investment opportunities, just as I had been. The difference was that they had apparently asked too many questions, demanded too much documentation, or threatened to expose his fraudulent operations. "You were lucky," Agent Chen told me during our second interview. Based on the pattern we've identified, investors who became suspicious or demanding usually disappeared within weeks of making those concerns known. Your decision to research the property records probably saved your life because it meant you discovered the fraud through your own investigation rather than confronting Justin directly. The arrest happened at a truck stop outside Oklahoma City, where Justin had been living under a false identity and apparently scouting for new victims among the farming communities of the Southern Plains. In his possession, authorities found detailed files on dozens of potential investors, including maps to secluded properties and what appeared to be plans for disposing of bodies in various rural locations. Justin confessed to 6 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though the FBI believes the actual number of victims is much higher. He received 6 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released from federal prison. The $2 million he had stolen from investors was never recovered, apparently spent on maintaining multiple identities and purchasing the tools and vehicles necessary for his killing spree. Nicole and I lost our life savings, but we gained something that felt even more valuable: the knowledge that we had survived an encounter with a serial killer who had been using financial fraud as a cover for murder. The investigation revealed that Anthony had actually been in danger too, because Justin had been asking neighbors about our family routines and whether our son walked home alone from school. The farmhouse where the bodies were found was eventually demolished after the FBI completed their forensic work, but the land remains undeveloped, marked only by a small memorial that lists the names of the confirmed victims. Local farmers still avoid the area, and the access road has been permanently closed by the county, creating a kind of dead zone in the landscape that serves as a constant reminder of the evil that had been operating among us. We moved to Colorado 6 months after Justin's arrest, unable to continue living in a community where we questioned every neighbor's motives and wondered what other secrets might be hidden behind friendly facades. The house in Millerville sold quickly but at a significant loss, as news of the murders had affected property values throughout the area. Nicole found work at a veterinary clinic in Fort Collins, and I transferred to a regional insurance office where no one knew about our experience with Justin or the investment scheme that had almost cost us everything. Anthony adapted to his new school with the resilience of teenagers, though he still has nightmares about the man who helped rebuild our garage and brought casseroles when his mother was sick. I know now that predators can spend years building trust and establishing credibility before revealing their true intentions. Justin had been patient, methodical, creating the perfect cover story for financial fraud while simultaneously identifying potential victims for murder. The investment opportunity was never about money. It was about finding isolated, trusting people who could be eliminated without triggering immediate suspicion. Most people invest with friends and neighbors because they trust the relationships they have built over years of shared experiences. But I learned that some people cultivate those relationships specifically to create opportunities for exploitation and violence. And sometimes the neighbor who helps you rebuild after a tornado is actually a serial killer who has been planning to bury you in an abandoned farmhouse since the day he moved to your street. The thing that haunts me most is remembering how natural and convincing Justin was during every interaction we had over those 15 years. There were no warning signs, no moments where his mask slipped, no behaviors that suggested he was anything other than the helpful neighbor we believed him to be. He attended church every Sunday, coached Little League baseball, and volunteered at the annual corn festival with the same enthusiasm as everyone else in our community. I never thought owning an auto repair shop would put me in a serial killer's crosshairs. I was 32, managing the family business in our small Nebraska town of 4,200 people. The kind of place where everybody knew everybody, where cars were left unlocked and kids walked to school without parents worrying. My wife Nicole and I had just bought our first house 3 blocks from Main Street, and life was moving along exactly as we had planned it. Quiet, predictable, safe. I had been pulling 12-hour days trying to get the shop ready for winter. That particular evening in late October, I had stayed until almost 11 p.m. working on Mrs. Henderson's old Buick because she needed it for her doctor's appointment the next morning. The only gas station open that late was the Shell on Route 47, about 3 miles outside town where the streetlights ended and the cornfields began. I knew the night clerk Ryan, a kid fresh out of high school who always had his earbuds in and a Monster energy drink sweating on the counter. My truck's fuel light had been glaring at me for the last 5 miles, and I figured I would grab a coffee too. Maybe one of those packaged sandwiches that had been sitting under the heat lamp since noon. The parking lot was empty except for a beat-up Chevy Silverado parked crooked near the dumpster, rust eating through the wheel wells and one headlight dimmer than the other. I pulled up to pump number 2, killed the engine, and stepped out into the kind of cold that makes your nose hair stiffen instantly. As I was unscrewing my gas cap, I noticed movement near the store entrance. 2 guys I had never seen before, both wearing dark hoodies. One was tall and lanky, maybe 6'3", with nervous energy that had him shifting his weight like a boxer warming up. The other was shorter, stockier, with a thick beard and hands shoved deep in his pockets. They were standing too close to Ryan, who had backed up against the cigarette display, his usual bored expression replaced with fear. I had already started pumping gas when I heard the first shout through the glass doors. The taller one had grabbed Ryan by the collar, lifting him off his feet, while the bearded one was behind the counter yanking at the cash register. I could see Ryan's mouth moving, probably explaining that he could not open the safe, that he did not have the combination. My first instinct was to get in my truck and drive away, call 911 from a safe distance. But then I saw the tall one pull something from his waistband. Even from 30 feet away through glass and bad lighting, I knew exactly what that dark metal shape was. And Ryan was just a kid, probably making minimum wage, definitely not getting paid enough to have a gun pointed at his temple. I left the pump running and started walking toward the store, my work boots crunching on loose gravel. I pulled out my phone, trying to look casual while dialing 911, but my fingers were numb from cold and adrenaline. The dispatcher answered just as I reached for the door handle, and I managed to whisper the address and robbery in progress before sliding the phone into my jacket pocket. The bell above the door chimed when I walked in, that cheerful electronic ding completely wrong for what was happening. Both men spun toward me with sharp predatory awareness. The tall one kept his gun on Ryan but shifted his body to face me. I could see his eyes now. Pale blue, bloodshot, pupils blown wide from what was probably methamphetamine. "Just getting coffee," I said, raising my hand slightly, trying to sound like I had not noticed anything unusual. The tall one studied me for what felt like hours, but was probably 3 seconds, his jaw working like he was chewing invisible gum. That gun hand trembling just enough to make me worry about an accidental trigger pull. That is when I noticed the tall one had moved closer to me, close enough that I could smell him. Stale sweat, cigarettes, and something chemical that burned my nostrils. "You are that mechanic guy," he said, and my whole body went rigid because being recognized meant this was about to get much worse than a simple robbery. "Fixed my cousin's Honda last month." His voice was raspy, like he had been screaming for hours. "Charged him $400 for an alternator." The gun was pointing at me now, wavering between my chest and my face. "That alternator failed already. My cousin had to miss work, lost his job, lost his apartment. That's on you." The logic was completely insane, but arguing with an armed drug addict about warranty policies seemed like a quick way to end up on the evening news. The bearded one was getting agitated, kept saying a name that sounded like Benjamin, and pulling at his partner's sleeve while glancing toward the door. Everything shifted in a matter of seconds. Sirens in the distance, faint but getting louder. Both men heard them at the same time I did. The bearded one bolted for the door immediately, bags clutched against his chest, knocking over a display of windshield wiper fluid that exploded across the floor in blue puddles. But the tall one did not run. Instead, his face went from angry to something else entirely, something blank and decided. "You did this," he said to me, and I knew what was coming before his arm extended fully, before his stance widened, before that finger stopped trembling and became steady with murderous purpose. I threw myself sideways toward the chip aisle, but I was 32 with bad knees from high school football. The first shot caught me in the lower back, right above my belt line, spinning me into the metal shelving. The second shot hit somewhere near my spine as I was falling, and then I could not feel my legs anymore. Just this strange absence where sensation should have been. The linoleum was cold against my cheek, and I could see under the shelves to where Ryan was crawling toward the back exit, leaving bloody handprints in the spreading pool of, blue washer fluid. The tall shooter stood over me for a moment, looking confused, like he had not expected it to be this easy or this awful to shoot an unarmed man. I tried to move, tried to crawl toward help, but below my waist was just nothing. I could taste copper in my mouth and feel something warm spreading under me, soaking through my work shirt, pooling faster than seemed possible. My phone was still in my pocket, the dispatcher probably still on the line. The cops arrived in what felt like hours but was probably under 2 minutes, their flashlights cutting through the store like lighthouse beams. An officer with a mustache knelt beside me, pressing something against my back while talking into his radio using codes I did not understand, but that sounded urgent. The paramedics came next, asking me questions I could not answer, telling me to stay awake when all I wanted was to close my eyes. One of them, a woman with a septum piercing who looked too young to be saving lives, held my hand while they got me on the backboard, saying I was doing great, that I was so strong. The next few months were a haze of surgeries, medical terms I could not pronounce, and learning that incomplete spinal injury meant I would probably never walk normally again. They caught both men 3 days later at a motel 40 miles north. The tall one was named Benjamin Garrett. The bearded one was named Alexander Walsh. Names that became permanent residents in my head, taking up space that should have been occupied by better memories. Benjamin got 25 to life. Alexander got 15 years. Numbers that seemed both too much and not enough for what they had taken from me and my family. Nicole had to sell the shop because we needed the money for medical bills and house modifications. Ramps, grab bars, a hospital bed that made our bedroom look like a care facility instead of the intimate space where we had planned our future together. The town rallied around us with fundraisers at the VFW hall and meal trains that lasted months. But there is a special kind of loneliness in being the guy everyone feels sorry for, in going from fixing cars with your hands to barely being able to hold a wrench steady. I still have dreams where I can run, where my legs work, where I make different choices that night. Maybe I just drive away. Maybe I do not stop for gas at all. But every morning I wake up to the same reality. A wheelchair beside the bed, Nicole's forced smile that does not quite reach her eyes anymore, and the knowledge that one Thursday night at a gas station changed everything. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought our little town was too small for this kind of violence. Most people can walk into a convenience store without calculating exit routes, or wondering if the other customers might be armed. But I know now that evil does not respect small town boundaries, that it can drive up in a rusty Silverado and destroy everything you have built in the space between two gunshots. I never thought my environmental testing job would uncover a decades-old murder conspiracy. I was 35, working as a state environmental inspector in Millerville, Colorado, a former mining town of 2,400 people tucked into a valley where the Rocky Mountains created natural barriers that kept the outside world at arm's length. The kind of place where families had lived for generations, where everyone knew each other's business, and where the biggest employer had always been the copper mine until it closed in 1987. My job involved testing soil and water samples throughout the region, ensuring that old industrial sites met current environmental standards before new development could proceed. It was routine work that rarely involved anything more exciting than elevated lead levels or contaminated groundwater from abandoned gas stations. I had been doing similar inspections for 8 years, and Millerville was supposed to be a straightforward assignment. The Blackwater copper mine had been sealed for over 30 years following what official records described as a structural collapse that killed 3 workers. The mine entrance was blocked with concrete barriers, warning signs posted throughout the area, and the entire site was surrounded by chain-link fencing that had rusted but remained intact. My assignment was to assess soil contamination levels in preparation for a housing development planned for the surrounding acreage. Benjamin Walsh, the current sheriff, met me at the site on a Tuesday morning in October, explaining the history of the mine and the 1987 accident that led to its closure. "Tragic business," he said, unlocking the gate that led to the testing area. 3 good men lost their lives when the main tunnel collapsed. The company sealed everything up rather than risk more casualties trying to recover the bodies. Sheriff Walsh seemed genuinely helpful, providing historical documents and maps that showed the mine's layout and the areas where I needed to collect samples. He even offered to accompany me during my initial site survey, though I assured him that would not be necessary. The testing process would take several days, and I preferred to work alone when collecting samples that required precise documentation. The first day's soil samples showed elevated copper levels, which was expected given the site's history, but nothing that would prevent development with proper remediation. I worked methodically, collecting samples in a grid pattern that extended from the sealed mine entrance toward the area where houses would eventually be built. It was on the second day that I discovered the anomaly. While testing soil near what the maps indicated was a ventilation shaft, my metal detector registered something large buried about 4 feet below the surface. The readings suggested metal objects much larger than the typical debris you would find around an old mining operation. I excavated carefully, following proper protocols for potentially hazardous materials, and uncovered what appeared to be a vehicle bumper. Further excavation revealed an entire pickup truck, a late 1980s Ford, buried deliberately and covered with a layer of mine tailings that had concealed it for decades. The truck's license plate was still attached, though corroded. I photographed everything before carefully brushing away enough dirt to read the numbers. A quick check of state records revealed that the vehicle had been registered to Marcus Thompson, reported missing in 1989 along with his wife Catherine and their teenage daughter Jessica. The Thompson family disappearance had been one of the region's most notorious unsolved cases. They had last been seen leaving their home in neighboring Riverside County, supposedly heading to California for a family vacation. Their house was found empty, mail piling up, but no evidence of foul play. The case had eventually gone cold, and most people assumed they had started new lives somewhere else. Finding their truck buried at the mine site changed everything. I immediately called the state police, and within hours the area was swarming with investigators, forensic specialists, and equipment for a full-scale excavation. Sheriff Walsh arrived shortly after the state police, and I noticed his demeanor had changed completely from our friendly interaction the previous day. Detective Sarah Chen from the state police took charge of the investigation, establishing a perimeter around the burial site and beginning the painstaking process of excavating the truck and searching for additional evidence. The work required several days, during which time I continued my environmental testing in other areas while staying available to answer questions about my discovery. The truck contained skeletal remains of 3 individuals, later confirmed through dental records to be the Thompson family. But the forensic examination revealed details that transformed this from a missing persons case into a homicide investigation. All 3 victims had suffered gunshot wounds to the head, and the truck showed evidence of being deliberately driven to this location before burial. Detective Chen interviewed me extensively about my discovery and the circumstances that led to finding the truck. During our conversation, she revealed information that made my blood run cold. The mine had not actually collapsed in 1987. According to geological surveys and mining company records she had obtained, the tunnels were structurally sound at the time of closure. The 3 workers who had supposedly died in the collapse were Marcus Thompson, Catherine Thompson, and their daughter Jessica. The official story about a mining accident had been fabricated to explain their disappearance and provide justification for sealing the mine site, preventing anyone from discovering their bodies. Further investigation revealed that Marcus Thompson had been a whistleblower, threatening to expose illegal dumping practices at the mine that violated federal environmental regulations. The mining company had been disposing of toxic waste in abandoned tunnels, saving millions of dollars in proper disposal costs while contaminating groundwater throughout the region. Marcus had documented these violations and planned to report them to federal authorities, which would have resulted in massive fines, criminal charges, and the mine's immediate closure. Instead of facing those consequences, someone had decided to eliminate the threat permanently. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of law enforcement and local government. Sheriff Walsh's predecessor, Ryan Martinez, had been directly involved in covering up the murders and creating the false narrative about the mining accident. Several county commissioners, mining company executives, and state inspectors had participated in the cover-up, ensuring that no investigation would uncover the truth. Detective Chen's investigation expanded rapidly, examining financial records, interviewing retired employees, and searching for additional evidence of corruption. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering, involving millions of dollars in bribes, falsified environmental reports, and systematic intimidation of anyone who might have questioned the official story. But the most shocking revelation came when Detective Chen arrested Sheriff Walsh himself. He had not just inherited the cover-up from his predecessor. He had been actively maintaining it for over a decade. The helpful cooperation he had shown during my initial site visit was actually an attempt to monitor my activities and ensure I did not discover anything that would expose the truth. Analysis of the buried truck revealed that it had been moved to the mine site shortly after the murders, using mining equipment to dig the burial pit and cover it with tailings. The entire operation had been planned and executed with the resources and authority of both the mining company and local law enforcement. The environmental contamination I had been hired to assess was actually much worse than anyone had suspected. The illegal dumping that Marcus Thompson had tried to expose had continued for years after his murder, turning the entire mine site into a toxic waste repository that posed serious health risks to the surrounding community. Federal investigators eventually identified 17 people involved in the conspiracy, including mining executives, county officials, and law enforcement officers. Sheriff Walsh received a life sentence for his role in the murders and cover-up. The mining company faced billions of dollars in cleanup costs and criminal penalties. The housing development that prompted my environmental assessment was permanently canceled. The entire mine site was designated as a Superfund cleanup location, requiring decades of remediation work to address the contamination that had been hidden for so long. I transferred to a different region 6 months after testifying in the trials that resulted from my discovery. Living in Millerville had become impossible once the community learned that their trusted sheriff had been protecting murderers and that their local government had been systematically lying to them for over 30 years. The experience taught me that environmental contamination often reflects deeper forms of corruption, and that the earth itself can preserve evidence of crimes that human institutions work desperately to conceal. Sometimes the most routine investigation can uncover secrets that powerful people have spent decades hiding. Most environmental inspectors test soil for chemical contamination and file reports that few people ever read. But I learned that some of us occasionally discover burial grounds that expose the toxic relationships between money, power, and violence in communities that appear peaceful on the surface. The Blackwater mine site remains closed, surrounded by new fencing and warning signs that tell only part of the truth about what lies beneath the surface. The real memorial to Marcus, Catherine, and Jessica Thompson is not the small marker placed near the former mine entrance, but the environmental cleanup that finally addresses the contamination Marcus died trying to expose. I never thought joining a Facebook group would put me on a predator's hunting list. I was 28, fresh out of a messy divorce, starting over as the new veterinarian in Millbrook, Ohio. A small town of 8,000 people nestled between rolling farmland and suburban sprawl. The kind of place where people still waved at strangers on Main Street and left casseroles on your doorstep when you moved in. After 3 years of marriage counseling and legal fees in Columbus, Millbrook felt like a sanctuary where I could rebuild my life quietly and safely. The veterinary clinic on Maple Avenue was everything I had dreamed of during those long nights in veterinary school. A converted Victorian house with original hardwood floors, large windows that let in afternoon sunlight, and examination rooms that still had the charm of someone's former living spaces. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the retiring vet, had built a practice where farmers trusted her with their prize cattle and families brought their golden retrievers for routine checkups with equal confidence. My apartment was a small one-bedroom above the bakery on Main Street, close enough to walk to work but far enough from my ex-husband's lawyers and process servers. The smell of fresh bread every morning felt like a promise that life could be simple and good again. Nicole, the baker downstairs, always had coffee ready by 6 a.m. and never asked personal questions, which I appreciated more than she probably realized. Joining the Millbrook Community Board Facebook group seemed like the logical next step toward integration. A place to learn about local events, find recommendations for everything from plumbers to pizza, and maybe make connections with people who did not know about my failed marriage or the reasons it ended so badly. The group had 1,200 members, mostly longtime residents sharing updates about school board meetings and lost cats. My introduction post was simple enough. Hi everyone, I'm Megan, the new vet taking over Dr. Hendricks' practice. Looking forward to meeting you all and serving the Millbrook community. Any recommendations for the best coffee shop? Innocent? Professional? The kind of post that should have generated a few friendly replies about local businesses and maybe some questions about veterinary services. Instead, it generated immediate attention that felt slightly off balance. Within an hour, I had 17 comments. Most of them welcoming, but a few that lingered in my memory with uncomfortable specificity. Welcome to town, beautiful. You'll love it here if you know how to appreciate the finer things. Another. Hope you're settling in well. The Victorian apartments on Main Street are charming, but the locks are pretty old. Might want to upgrade for safety. The second comment bothered me enough that I walked downstairs to ask Nicole about building security. She assured me the front door lock had been upgraded recently and that Main Street was perfectly safe, but something in her expression suggested she was not entirely convinced. "Just keep your apartment door locked," she said, avoiding eye contact while wiping down the counter with more force than necessary. Alexander Smith started private messaging me 3 days after my introduction post. His profile picture showed a pleasant-looking man in his early 40s, brown hair, kind eyes, wearing a flannel shirt against what looked like a farm backdrop. His posts in the community group were always helpful, informative, the kind of content you would expect from a longtime resident who genuinely cared about his neighbors. "Welcome to Millbrook," his first message read. "I know starting over in a new place can be overwhelming. If you need any help navigating local services or just want someone to show you around, I'd be happy to help. I've lived here my whole life and know everyone worth knowing." Friendly, appropriate, the kind of offer I might have accepted from a neighbor in a different context. But Alexander's messages became more frequent and progressively more personal. He knew I was divorced before I had mentioned it publicly. He knew I worked late on Thursdays because the clinic stayed open for emergency calls. He knew I lived alone above the bakery, knew my apartment number, knew that I usually got home around 7 p.m. and that my bedroom faced the alley behind Main Street. "I noticed your lights were on pretty late last night," one message read. "Everything okay? It's not safe for a woman to be wandering around alone after dark in an unfamiliar place. There are people in this town who might take advantage of someone new, someone vulnerable." The concern felt manufactured, and the word vulnerable made my skin crawl with recognition. I stopped responding to Alexander's messages, but that did not stop them from arriving. 3 or 4 per day, each one revealing more intimate knowledge of my daily routine than any stranger should possess. He knew I bought groceries on Tuesday evenings at the IGA, knew I usually walked to work rather than driving, knew I had been asking around about hiking trails in the state park. The messages shifted from friendly offers to subtle warnings about other people in town. "Be careful of the construction workers renovating the bank building. They've been asking about the new vet, specifically whether you live alone. And some of the guys at Murphy's bar have been talking about you. Nothing dangerous, but small-town gossip can get uncomfortable quickly." I started varying my routine, taking different routes to work, shopping at different times, staying late at the clinic to avoid walking home during predictable hours. But Alexander's messages suggested he was adapting to my changes faster than I was making them. "Saw you took the back road home tonight. Smart choice. Oak Street has better lighting and more foot traffic. The veterinary clinic's security cameras captured something that made my blood freeze during my 3rd week in town. I had stayed late on a Thursday to monitor a golden retriever recovering from surgery, and around 10 p.m. I noticed movement in the parking lot. A figure standing near the back entrance, not quite close enough to trigger the motion lights, but positioned where he could watch both the clinic and my apartment windows across the street. The video quality was not perfect, but the height and build matched Alexander's profile pictures exactly. He stood there for 47 minutes according to the timestamp, occasionally checking his phone, never moving far enough from the shadows to be clearly visible to anyone looking out casually. When I finally left through the front entrance, he was gone, but my apartment lights were visible from where he had been standing. I called the police the next morning, bringing printed screenshots of Alexander's messages and the security footage. Officer Ryan Mills looked through everything with the patient thoroughness of someone who had dealt with stalking cases before, but his expression told me what I was afraid to hear. "Nothing here is technically threatening," he explained. "Weird, uncomfortable, definitely crossing boundaries, but not criminal. We can talk to him, ask him to back off, but without explicit threats or physical contact, our options are limited." Alexander stopped messaging me after the police visit, but that felt more ominous than reassuring. The sudden silence suggested he knew about law enforcement involvement, which meant he was either more connected in town than his profile suggested, or more observant than I had realized. My routine changes became more extreme. Different grocery stores in neighboring towns, varying work schedules, asking Nicole to accept packages so I would not have to interact with delivery drivers. The break-in happened on a Tuesday in November during the 3 hours I spent at a veterinary conference in Mansfield. Someone had picked the lock on my apartment door with professional precision, leaving no scratches on the metal, no signs of forced entry. Nothing was missing, but everything felt wrong in ways I could not initially identify. My underwear drawer had been searched, items refolded but not quite in the same positions. My bathroom cabinet showed similar signs of careful inspection. Whoever had been inside had spent time in my bedroom, possibly going through my closet, definitely handling personal items with a thoroughness that made me nauseous to contemplate. The police found no fingerprints, no evidence that would stand up in court, no proof that anyone had been inside at all. "Could be you're misremembering how you left things," Officer Mills suggested gently. Stress and paranoia can make people hyper-aware of details that might normally go unnoticed. But I knew what I knew. And what I knew was that Alexander Smith or someone working with him had been inside my home. I hired a private investigator the next day, a former police detective named Sarah Cross who specialized in stalking and harassment cases. Sarah's background check on Alexander Smith revealed information that shattered any remaining sense of safety I had in Millbrook. Alexander Smith was not a local farmer or longtime resident. Alexander Smith was not even his real name. His actual identity was Marcus Allen Walsh, and he had restraining orders filed against him in 3 different states. The Facebook profile, the helpful community posts, the entire persona of Alexander Smith had been constructed over the course of 18 months, carefully building credibility and local connections in preparation for whatever he was planning to do to me. Sarah's investigation revealed that Marcus had a pattern of targeting women who posted in small-town Facebook groups, particularly women who mentioned being new to the area or recently divorced. He researched his victims thoroughly, sometimes for months, learning their routines and vulnerabilities before making contact. The farm backdrop in his profile picture was stock photography. The helpful posts in community groups were often copied from other towns' Facebook discussions. Most terrifyingly, Marcus had not been working alone. Sarah discovered connections between his activities and at least 2 other fake Facebook profiles in the Millbrook group. The construction workers he had warned me about were actually watching me for him. The men at Murphy's bar discussing me were reporting back to someone who was coordinating my surveillance with frightening efficiency. "You were selected," Sarah explained during our second meeting, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had seen this pattern too many times before. "New to town, recently divorced, living alone, working a job that requires predictable hours. You checked every box on their target list. The Facebook post was just confirming what they already suspected about your availability and vulnerability." The FBI arrested Marcus Allen Walsh and 2 accomplices 3 weeks later at a motel in Kentucky, where they found detailed files on 17 women across 6 states. My file was the thickest, filled with photographs taken from outside my apartment, copies of veterinary records they had somehow accessed, and a timeline of my daily activities that spanned nearly 2 months. Marcus received 15 years in federal prison. His accomplices got shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, revealing a network of men who used social media to identify and hunt isolated women in small communities across the Midwest. The Millbrook Community Board Facebook group had been compromised for over a year, with multiple fake profiles gathering intelligence on potential victims. I left Millbrook 3 days after the arrests, driving straight through to Oregon where my sister lives and where I could disappear into a city large enough that anonymity felt possible again. The veterinary practice went to a colleague from veterinary school who had no idea why I was selling so cheaply or why I refused to discuss my reasons for leaving. Nicole from the bakery still sends Christmas cards, always including updates about Millbrook that I read with the fascination of someone who survived a disaster and needs to know the aftermath. The Facebook group was disbanded after the FBI investigation revealed the extent of infiltration. The clinic continues to thrive under new ownership. Life goes on for everyone who was not selected as prey. But I know now that digital communities are hunting grounds, that social media profiles can be elaborate traps, that predators study their victims with the patience and thoroughness of scientists conducting research. I know that small towns are not inherently safer than cities, just easier to monitor and control when you have the right connections and enough advanced planning. Most people join community Facebook groups to find restaurant recommendations and learn about local events. But I learned that some people join to find victims, to identify women who are alone and vulnerable, to gather intelligence for crimes that unfold over months rather than minutes. And sometimes the friendly neighbor who offers to help you settle in is actually a predator who has been preparing to destroy your life since the moment you announced your existence to his hunting ground. The investigation also revealed something that still keeps me awake at night. Marcus had been planning to escalate beyond surveillance and psychological intimidation. In his hotel room, agents found zip ties, duct tape, and a detailed map showing the route from my apartment to an abandoned farmhouse 40 miles outside Millbrook. Sarah told me later that based on similar cases, I probably had less than a week before he moved from watching to acting. I never thought working as a forest ranger would put me face to face with something that defied every natural law I understood. I was 30, stationed at the Pine Ridge Ranger Station in northern Idaho, responsible for monitoring 50,000 acres of wilderness that surrounded our tiny community of maybe 200 year-round residents. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where the nearest town was 40 miles of winding mountain roads, and where the biggest excitement was usually a lost hiker or the occasional bear sighting. I had been working these forests for 6 years, knew every trail, every creek crossing, every place where cell phone service cut out completely. The job suited me perfectly after my divorce, offering solitude and purpose in equal measure. My days were spent checking campsites, maintaining trails, and educating tourists who thought a day hike required nothing more than sneakers and a water bottle. The first sign something was wrong came during my regular patrol of the Blackwater Trail in early September. I was checking the primitive campsites along the creek, making sure previous visitors had properly extinguished their fires and packed out their trash, when I noticed the stones. Someone had arranged rocks in a perfect spiral pattern about 15 feet from the established fire ring, each stone precisely placed with mathematical accuracy. Campers occasionally built unauthorized fire rings or stacked rocks as markers, but this was different. The spiral was too precise, too deliberate, and the stones had been selected for specific sizes and colors in a way that suggested knowledge of some system I did not understand. I photographed the arrangement and dismantled it, assuming it was the work of some artistic camper who did not realize they were supposed to leave no trace. But 3 days later, during my next patrol of the area, the spiral was back. Exactly the same pattern, using the same stones I had scattered, rebuilt with the same mathematical precision. This time I left it undisturbed and set up a trail camera about 50 yards away, hidden behind a fallen log where it could monitor the area without being easily spotted. The footage from that first week showed nothing unusual during daylight hours. Hikers passed by without seeming to notice the stone arrangement. A family of deer grazed nearby one afternoon, but the night footage was different. Something moved through the frame around 2:30 a.m. on the fourth night, too quickly for the camera to capture clearly, but large enough to trigger the motion sensor. I reviewed that segment repeatedly, enhancing the image as much as possible with the equipment available at the ranger station. What I saw looked human in size and shape, but the movement was wrong. It glided between trees without disturbing branches, covered ground too quickly, and seemed to understand exactly where the camera was positioned because it remained mostly out of frame. Over the next 2 weeks, I found similar stone spirals at 3 other locations throughout my patrol area. Always in remote spots, always built with the same mathematical precision, always accompanied by other subtle signs that someone or something was moving through the forest with intimate knowledge of the terrain. Broken branches that formed directional arrows, scratched bark on trees that created crude symbols, footprints that appeared for a few yards before vanishing completely. The footprints were the most disturbing discovery. They were roughly human in size and shape, but the stride length was impossible for any person to achieve naturally. The depth and spacing suggested someone taking steps of 8 to 10 feet across uneven forest floor, something that would require superhuman strength and balance. I started carrying additional equipment during my patrols. A better camera, motion sensors, audio recording devices, anything that might help me document whatever was creating these signs. My supervisor, Benjamin, thought I was becoming paranoid about vandalism, but he supported my investigation as long as it did not interfere with regular duties. The breakthrough came during a night patrol in late September. I was checking the Whitman Creek area around midnight when I heard sounds that made my blood freeze. Footsteps moving parallel to my position, maintaining perfect pace with my movement, staying just beyond the range of my flashlight. When I stopped, the footsteps stopped. When I continued, they resumed. I tried calling out, thinking it might be a lost hiker, but received no response. The footsteps continued for nearly 20 minutes, never getting closer but never falling behind, as if something was studying my movements with scientific precision. When I finally reached my vehicle and drove back to the ranger station, I felt eyes watching from the tree line until I was completely out of the forest. The next morning, I found fresh stone spirals at 2 locations I had visited during that night patrol. But these were different from the earlier arrangements. The stones were larger, the patterns more complex, and they incorporated elements that seemed specifically designed to communicate something. Small bones arranged in geometric patterns, feathers from local birds woven into the stone arrangements, pieces of bark carved with symbols that resembled no writing system I recognized. I contacted Dr. Sarah Martinez, an anthropologist at the University of Idaho, sending her photographs of the symbols and arrangements. Her response was immediate and alarming. The patterns matched descriptions from Native American folklore about forest entities that existed between the human and spirit worlds. Beings that served as guardians or warnings for people who ventured too deep into sacred wilderness areas. According to Dr. Martinez, several tribes in the region had legends about watchers that monitored human activity in certain forests, particularly areas where ancient burial grounds or ceremonial sites were located. The stone spirals and carved symbols were traditional methods these entities used to mark territory and communicate with humans who were sensitive enough to recognize their presence. But Dr. Martinez also mentioned something that made my situation much more serious. According to the folklore, these entities typically ignored human activity unless they perceived a threat to the forest or its sacred sites. The fact that one was actively engaging with me, creating increasingly complex arrangements and following my movements, suggested it was trying to communicate something urgent. I spent the next week researching the history of the Pine Ridge area, discovering information that the Forest Service had never included in our training materials. The entire region had been used by local tribes for centuries as a burial ground for important leaders and shamans. Several sites throughout my patrol area contained remains that were considered sacred and protected by both federal law and tribal agreements. The revelation that I had been unknowingly walking through ancient burial sites explained the Watcher's behavior. It was not threatening me directly, but trying to educate me about the significance of the areas I was responsible for protecting. The stone spirals were markers indicating sacred sites. The carved symbols were warnings about places where human activity should be limited or avoided entirely. I contacted the regional tribal council, explaining my experiences and asking for guidance on how to properly respect the sacred areas within my patrol zone. The response was swift and supportive. Tribal Elder Ryan Whitehorse agreed to meet with me and conduct a formal blessing ceremony to acknowledge my new understanding of the forest's spiritual significance. During the ceremony, conducted at sunrise near one of the stone spiral sites, Elder Whitehorse explained that the Watcher I had been encountering was likely the spirit of an ancient guardian whose responsibility was to protect the burial sites from disturbance. My willingness to learn and adapt had apparently satisfied this spirit, because the mysterious activities ceased immediately after the blessing. The stone spirals remained in place, but they stopped appearing in new locations. The footprints and carved symbols disappeared entirely. My night patrols returned to normal with only the usual sounds of wildlife and wind through the trees. But I maintained the protocols Elder Whitehorse had taught me, approaching certain areas with greater reverence and limiting tourist access to the most sensitive sites. 6 months later, I was promoted to district supervisor, partially because of my work documenting and protecting the cultural resources within the Pine Ridge area. The experience had taught me that forests contain layers of history and significance that extend far beyond what appears on topographic maps or in government databases. I still patrol the same trails, but with different eyes and deeper respect for the ancient connections between land and spirit that most people never recognize. The Watcher taught me that some things in the wilderness demand acknowledgement rather than explanation, and that the most important part of protecting natural areas is understanding their complete history, not just their biological significance. Most forest rangers monitor wildlife populations and maintain recreational facilities. But I learned that some of us are called to serve as bridges between the modern world and ancient responsibilities that predate government agencies by thousands of years. Sometimes the most important part of protecting a forest is recognizing that you are not its first guardian, just its most recent one. The stone spirals still appear occasionally, but now I understand them as gifts rather than warnings. Reminders that the forest holds wisdom older than any human institution, and that true stewardship requires humility before forces we may never fully comprehend, but must always respect. I never thought working the night shift at a truck stop diner would put me on a serial killer's target list. I was 24, waiting tables at Murphy's 24-hour diner in Millerville, Wyoming, a town of 3,400 people that sits right on Highway 47, where truckers and travelers pass through on their way between Denver and Salt Lake City. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's story, where strangers stick out immediately, and where the biggest excitement was usually someone's credit card getting declined or a trucker falling asleep in his rig. The diner was one of those classic roadside establishments that had been serving coffee and pie since the 1960s, with red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and a jukebox that still played actual records. I worked the overnight shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., serving coffee to long-haul truckers and the occasional lost tourist who had taken a wrong turn somewhere in the vast Wyoming darkness. My routine was simple and predictable. Clock in at 10, serve truckers and insomniacs until the morning rush started around 5:30. then walk home to my apartment on Oakwood Drive as the sun came up. It was a 15-minute walk through residential streets that were completely safe, past houses where people left their doors unlocked and kids still played in unfenced yards. The first sign something was wrong came during my second week of March when a trucker named Alexander started asking questions that felt too personal for casual conversation. He was a regular customer, drove for a freight company out of Nebraska, and usually stopped at Murphy's twice a week on his route. But his questions had shifted from general friendliness to specific curiosity about my schedule, my living situation, and whether I walked home alone. "You shouldn't be walking by yourself at that hour," Alexander said during one of his visits, stirring sugar into his coffee with more attention than the task required. "A pretty young girl like you living alone, there are people who might take advantage of that. Dangerous people pass through here all the time." I assured him that Millerville was perfectly safe, that I had been walking home alone for months without any problems, but Alexander's concern felt manufactured in a way that made me uncomfortable. He knew too much about my routine, mentioned details about my apartment location that I had never shared with any customer. Other truckers started making similar comments. Benjamin, who drove for a different company but seemed to know Alexander, mentioned seeing me walk down Oakwood Drive and suggested that I should consider getting rides home instead of walking alone in the dark. Ryan, another regular, asked whether my family knew I was working nights and walking home by myself. The questions felt coordinated, as if these men were sharing information about me and comparing notes about my habits and vulnerabilities. I started paying closer attention to their conversations, noticing that they often sat together when their stops at the diner coincided, and that they seemed to have detailed knowledge of Millerville's layout despite supposedly just passing through. It was during the last week of March that I realized the scope of what was happening. A trucker I had never seen before came in around 2 a.m., ordered coffee and pie, and spent over an hour asking casual questions about the area. Where did most of the young women in town live? Were there college students? Did people generally feel safe walking alone at night? When I asked him about his route, he gave vague answers about picking up loads in the area but could not name any specific businesses or destinations. His truck was parked where I could see it through the diner's front windows, and I noticed he spent a lot of time looking at a notebook, writing down information between sips of coffee. I started documenting these interactions, writing down license plate numbers, descriptions of the truckers who asked unusual questions, and details about their apparent knowledge of local geography and residents. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. At least 6 different men, all claiming to be independent truckers, had been asking similar questions over the past month. The breakthrough came when I overheard part of a conversation between Alexander and Benjamin during a busy Friday night. They were discussing the girl who walks on Oakwood and mentioning specific details about my apartment building, including which unit I lived in and which direction I approached from when walking home. Most chillingly, Alexander mentioned something about the collection schedule and how I fit the profile perfectly. The conversation ended abruptly when they noticed I was within earshot, but I had heard enough to understand that my routine was being studied by multiple people who were coordinating their observations. I called the Wyoming State Police the next morning, speaking with Detective Sarah Walsh, who specialized in interstate crimes involving truckers and highway predators. She took my report seriously, particularly when I described the coordinated nature of the questioning and the detailed knowledge these men seemed to have about local women and their routines. Detective Walsh explained that law enforcement had been tracking a pattern of disappearances along truck routes throughout the Mountain West, cases where young women working night shifts or walking alone had vanished without a trace. The victims were typically between 20 and 30 years old, lived alone, and worked jobs that required predictable late-night schedules. "What you're describing fits a pattern we've been investigating for over a year," Detective Walsh told me. Groups of truckers working together to identify and track potential victims in small towns along their routes. They share information, study routines, and coordinate abductions that appear random but are actually carefully planned operations. The state police set up surveillance around the diner and my apartment, monitoring the truckers who had been asking questions about me. They also installed recording equipment to document conversations between the suspected predators, hoping to gather evidence that would support federal charges for conspiracy and interstate trafficking. The arrest happened 3 weeks later when Alexander and Benjamin attempted to approach me while I was walking home from work. They had parked their truck strategically along my route, with Alexander waiting near my apartment building while Benjamin positioned himself to block my normal path, forcing me to walk past where Alexander was waiting. Plainclothes officers intervened before they could make contact with me, arresting both men and discovering evidence in their trucks that revealed the extent of their operation. They found detailed files on dozens of women throughout Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, including photographs, work schedules, and home addresses gathered during months of surveillance. The investigation expanded rapidly, revealing a trafficking network that involved 17 truckers operating across 8 states. They had been abducting women from small towns along their routes, transporting victims across state lines and selling them to buyers in major cities. The operation had been active for over 3 years, and law enforcement believes they were responsible for at least 23 disappearances. Alexander received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Benjamin and 4 other core members of the network received sentences ranging from 25 to 40 years. The remaining truckers received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation, but their testimonies revealed the sophisticated planning and coordination behind what had appeared to be random disappearances. I quit my job at Murphy's Diner and moved to Colorado Springs 2 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in Millerville, where I constantly worried about whether other predators might be studying my routines. The knowledge that I had been selected as a target, that my daily activities had been documented and shared among criminals planning my abduction, made it impossible to feel safe in familiar surroundings. The diner closed permanently 6 months later, unable to recover from the negative publicity surrounding the case. Highway 47 still carries truckers and travelers through Millerville, but the town installed additional street lighting and organized community watch programs to monitor suspicious activity around businesses frequented by transient workers. Detective Walsh told me that my willingness to document the suspicious behavior and report it promptly probably saved my life and prevented other abductions. The network had been planning to take me during my walk home on April 15th, exactly 2 weeks after I contacted law enforcement. My cooperation provided the evidence needed to identify and arrest the entire operation. I still work night shifts, but now in a large city where anonymity provides security and where public transportation eliminates the need to walk alone through predictable routes. The experience taught me that predators often hide behind legitimate occupations and normal appearances, and that what seems like casual conversation can actually be intelligence gathering for criminal purposes. Most people who work night shifts worry about drunk customers or difficult co-workers. But I learned that some of us are being studied by organized criminals who see our routines as opportunities and our isolation as vulnerability. Highway truck stops and late-night diners can serve as hunting grounds for predators who understand that small-town trust and predictable schedules create perfect conditions for crimes that leave few witnesses and fewer clues. The network's files revealed that they had been monitoring Murphy's Diner for over 2 years, documenting the schedules and routines of every female employee. I was their primary target, but they had backup plans involving 2 other women who worked in town. The coordinated surveillance and planning involved in their operation was more sophisticated than anything local law enforcement had encountered, requiring federal resources and interstate cooperation to fully investigate and prosecute. Millerville still feels the impact of discovering that their small town had been a hunting ground for interstate traffickers. Property values declined, several businesses closed, and many families moved away rather than continue living in a community that had been systematically stalked by criminals who understood exactly how to exploit rural isolation and small-town routines for predatory purposes. I never thought working part-time at a pharmacy would expose me to a conspiracy that connected murder to prescription fraud. I was 38, recently divorced, trying to rebuild my life in Millerville, Colorado, after losing nearly everything in my ex-husband's investment schemes. The town felt like the perfect place to start over, small enough that people looked out for each other, but large enough that I could maintain some privacy about my past failures. Henderson's Pharmacy on Main Street was exactly what I needed after the chaos of my marriage collapsed. Clean, quiet work organizing inventory, processing insurance claims, and helping customers with routine prescriptions. The pay was modest, but it was honest work that let me sleep at night, something I had not been able to do during the final months of fighting lawyers and creditors. Dr. Anthony had been the town pharmacist for over 20 years, one of those trusted community figures who knew everyone's medical history and family secrets. People brought their prescriptions to Henderson's not just because it was convenient, but because Dr. Anthony remembered their names, asked about their children, and genuinely cared about their health and well-being. During my second week on the job, I started noticing patterns in the prescription orders that seemed unusual for a small-town pharmacy. Large quantities of pain medication being ordered for patients I knew had died months earlier. Expensive drugs prescribed to people who, according to local knowledge, had never been seriously ill. Prescription bottles being prepared for pickup but never collected, accumulating in storage bins behind the counter. When I mentioned these observations to Dr. Anthony, his response was immediate and defensive. "Patient privacy is sacred," he told me, his voice carrying an edge I had never heard before. "We cannot discuss individual prescriptions or make assumptions about what people need. Our job is to fill what doctors prescribe, not to question medical decisions." His reaction felt disproportionate to what had been casual observations about workflow efficiency, but I attributed it to professional caution and my own inexperience in pharmacy operations. I focused on learning my duties and avoiding further questions about prescription patterns that were probably normal but unfamiliar to someone new to the business. It was during my third week that I discovered the storage room in the basement that Dr. Anthony had told me was for old records and equipment. While looking for inventory supplies, I found boxes of prescription medications that had supposedly been dispensed to customers but were clearly still in the pharmacy's possession. Thousands of pills, bottles still sealed, representing tens of thousands of dollars in medications that insurance companies had paid for but patients had never received. The medications were primarily pain management drugs, anxiety medications, and other controlled substances that had high street value. The quantities were staggering, suggesting systematic fraud over months or years rather than isolated incidents of unclaimed prescriptions. I photographed several boxes before leaving the storage room, uncertain about what I had discovered, but knowing it represented something serious enough to require documentation. That evening, I researched prescription fraud, learning about the connection between illegally diverted medications and both organized crime and individual dealers who supplied black market drug operations. The next morning, Dr. Anthony called me into his office, his demeanor completely different from the friendly employer I had come to know. "Someone has been in the storage room without authorization," he said, watching my reaction carefully. That area contains confidential patient records and is off limits to all staff except myself. I assured him I had only been looking for inventory supplies, but his expression remained hostile and suspicious. Patient privacy violations are federal crimes, he continued. People who compromise medical confidentiality can face serious legal consequences, including criminal charges that would make it impossible to find employment in healthcare or other professional fields. The threat was clear, even though it was couched in language about regulatory compliance. Dr. Anthony was warning me to stay away from the storage room and to keep quiet about anything I might have seen. But his reaction confirmed that what I had discovered was significant enough to justify intimidation. Over the next week, I paid closer attention to the pharmacy's operations, documenting discrepancies between prescription orders, insurance billing, and actual dispensing. The pattern that emerged was systematic fraud involving fake prescriptions, billing for medications never delivered to patients, and diversion of controlled substances for illegal distribution. Dr. Anthony was working with someone to generate fraudulent prescriptions using the names and insurance information of deceased patients and people who had moved away from the area. The medications were being billed to insurance companies and government programs, but instead of being dispensed to patients, they were being accumulated for resale on the black market. But the operation was more complex than simple prescription fraud. I discovered that some of the fake prescriptions were being written for people who had died under suspicious circumstances. Individuals whose deaths had been explained as natural causes or accidents, but who had been in good health before their sudden passing. Among the names on fraudulent prescriptions, I recognized several people who had died within the past 2 years. Margaret Thompson, an elderly woman who had supposedly died of heart failure but had been active and healthy just weeks before her death. Robert Jenkins, a middle-aged farmer who had allegedly died in a farming accident but whose injuries, according to local gossip, had been inconsistent with the official explanation. The realization that Dr. Anthony might be connected to suspicious deaths in addition to prescription fraud made my situation much more dangerous. If he was willing to commit murder to maintain his fraudulent operation, my knowledge of his activities put me at serious risk. I contacted the Drug Enforcement Administration, speaking with Agent Benjamin Martinez, who specialized in prescription fraud and pharmaceutical diversion cases. Agent Martinez took my report seriously, particularly when I described the connections between fraudulent prescriptions and recent deaths in the community. What you're describing could be part of a systematic operation involving both fraud and homicide, Agent Martinez explained. Pharmacists who kill patients to maintain fraudulent prescriptions represent one of the most dangerous types of healthcare fraud because they have both the means and the access necessary to commit murders that appear natural. The DEA launched an investigation, installing surveillance equipment in the pharmacy and monitoring Dr. Anthony's communications and financial transactions. They also began reviewing the medical records and death certificates of people whose names had been used for fraudulent prescriptions, looking for evidence of homicide disguised as natural death. The breakthrough came when forensic pathologists exhumed the bodies of 3 people whose names appeared on fraudulent prescriptions written after their deaths. Toxicology analysis revealed lethal doses of medications that Dr. Anthony had access to through his pharmacy. Drugs that would cause symptoms resembling heart failure or other natural causes of death. Dr. Anthony was arrested at the pharmacy during normal business hours, an event that shocked the entire community. People who had trusted him with their most intimate health information discovered that he had been systematically defrauding insurance programs, diverting controlled substances, and murdering patients who might have exposed his crimes. The investigation expanded to include law enforcement officers who had failed to properly investigate suspicious deaths, medical examiners who had signed death certificates without adequate examination, and insurance investigators who had ignored patterns of fraud. The conspiracy involved multiple levels of the healthcare and legal systems, all working to protect a murderous pharmacist. Dr. Anthony confessed to 7 murders in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, though investigators believe the actual number of victims was much higher. He had been killing patients who asked too many questions about their medications, who noticed discrepancies in their prescriptions, or who threatened to report irregularities to authorities. The pharmacy closed permanently after Dr. Anthony's arrest, leaving the community without convenient access to prescription medications. Many residents had to drive 40 miles to the nearest town for prescriptions, a hardship that particularly affected elderly and disabled people who had depended on Henderson's pharmacy for decades. I moved to Denver 3 months after the arrests, unable to continue living in a community where I had unknowingly worked for a serial killer who had used prescription fraud to cover his murders. The knowledge that I had been processing fake prescriptions for dead patients, some of whom Dr. Anthony had killed personally, made it impossible to feel comfortable in Millerville. The experience taught me that healthcare fraud often masks more serious crimes and that people in trusted positions can exploit that trust to commit murder with impunity for years before being discovered. Dr. Anthony had killed 7 people, stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars, and corrupted multiple systems designed to protect public health, all while maintaining the facade of a caring small-town pharmacist. Agent Martinez told me that my decision to document the suspicious patterns and report them promptly prevented additional murders and exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for years. Dr. Anthony had been planning to expand his operation, recruiting other pharmacists in neighboring towns to participate in the fraud and murder scheme. Most people trust their pharmacists to provide medications safely and legally. But I learned that some healthcare providers use their professional credentials to commit sophisticated crimes that exploit both insurance systems and patient trust. The prescription medications that are supposed to heal can become tools for fraud, theft, and murder when dispensed by someone who values profit over human life.